The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Can I welcome everyone to this online remote session of the Home Affairs Select Committee. Can I convey our gratitude to the House of Commons staff who have made this possible in terms of the technology to underpin it, and also to our witnesses for joining us today at a time when scrutiny and public information is immensely important at the middle of this extremely difficult coronavirus crisis. We're very grateful for everyone who's made the arrangements so that we can continue our work. Today we will be taking evidence from the police, first from the Police Federation and Police Superintendents Association. Following that, we will be taking evidence from the Chief Constables from 4 forces across the country, and we look forward to hearing from the Home Secretary next week. We are also, as a committee, seeking further evidence on domestic abuse and the consequences for domestic abuse as part of the crisis, during the crisis as well. Can I begin our evidence session by welcoming our first panel. We have Police Sergeant Simon Kempton from the Police Federation and Chief Superintendent Paul Griffiths from the Police Superintendents Association. Can I also begin by conveying our thanks to police officers and staff right across the country who are working so hard at this extremely difficult time to keep people safe. Welcome to you. Can I begin by asking you both, what are the main issues that are facing the police across the country at the moment as a result of the coronavirus crisis? Beginning with Police Sergeant Simon Kempton.
Good afternoon, Shane. Good afternoon, committee. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. Normally, we'd be represented by my colleague, John Apter, our chair. He sends his apologies. He's still recovering, actually, from the coronavirus. But I've been our operational lead for the COVID-19 since the beginning of the outbreak. And my role has been one to facilitate communication between the frontline and the operational team, particularly in reflecting the main concerns of the frontline to the operational team so they can try to adjust their plans accordingly. And my operational colleagues tell me there's four main concerns that they put across. And the first one is PPE, protective equipment, access to protective equipment where they need it and when they need it, and getting it through in a timely fashion, getting it replenished, and making sure it's the right spec of kit. Secondly, communications. What my colleagues do, Chair, is a really difficult job in these incredible, unprecedented circumstances. What makes their job easier is if the communications with chief officers and government, the guidance they're given is clear and concise and consistent across the country. The issue of testing is very important to my colleagues, partly because it affects them, but also it gives reassurance to their families as well. We've got a huge amount of staff at the minute who are unable to work because they're in self-isolation, and the issue of testing could relieve some of the burden on the front line, some of the numbers, to get some people back. And finally, the fourth main concern is we're in unprecedented times. We've never had this before. We need to do our job to protect the public in a different way. We need to be innovative. We need to think about how we protect the public without putting officers and the public at greater risk of contracting this virus. And around the country, there's some pockets of superb practice going on where we can still do our job, still be there for the public, but without putting ourselves on offer. And I'd love the opportunity to answer any questions on those areas.
Thank you. Chief Superintendent Griffiths.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I mean, the pace and scale by which we've had to deal with this crisis is quite incredible. Our members are trained and equipped to deal with many crises, major incidents, serious incidents, but this is unprecedented and uncharted waters. When we've spoken to our members, they've, similar to Simon's narrative, have raised 4 key areas that we feel as a service we just need to ensure that we focus on to deliver the best possible service in support of our health colleagues and also the country. I think, reiterating what Simon has already said, the safety and well-being of our staff is paramount to make sure that we can conduct our duties. Simon's already mentioned PPE and also testing. They are both key to enable our staff to either return to work if they're self-isolating on the testing front, but when they're deployed, to make sure they've got the appropriate kit and the appropriate advice and guidance as to how to do their duties effectively. The second thing is, both in the immediate and forward thinking, is around the resilience of the service. We have, over the last 10 years, taken quite a dip in the amount of police officers that we have available to do our duties, and that was changing over the last 6 to 9 months with the announcement of the 20,000 uplift. There is the immediate issue in terms of staff absence around those that are affected by the disease, those are self-isolating, and those who have caring duties. But our members are also looking forward in terms of the resilience of the service as this crisis continues over the weeks and months to come. And it's something that we really need to forward look in terms of the impact that it could have on all police officers at all ranks. The third issue that our members are raising is the change in demand that will come through our society. We are clearly seeing a downward trend in what are called public offences, acquisitive crime, etc. And there is a dip in terms of emergency calls, non-emergency calls, and naturally arrests and custody. But crime and demand will change. And that is where our concern lies about the private space in terms of the risk around domestic abuse, child sexual abuse, and other matters that may be occurring in the domestic residence. And there's also the rise in online crime and technical crime and cybercrime. And those are areas of which we need to properly focus in terms of change in demand and change in incidents. And the final area that our members are raising is in terms of our relationship with the public. It is dear to us. It is what we're about in terms of consent and the consent and policing by consent. With the new emergency powers, we need to maintain that working relationship with the public. It is really important for us to do so. We recognise the powers that we've been given, but our strategy remains strong in terms of trying to engage and explain the situation before we ever, as a last resort, have to turn to enforcement. So those are the 4 key areas that our members are raising as we look forward into the crisis as it continues to develop.
Thank you. Can I just ask you a particular question about the testing then? Have you been given any idea about when the police might be able to access testing in any form as part of the government's testing strategy?
Would you like me to answer it first? Yeah. So we obviously the key workers that they're focusing on at the moment is National Health Service, and we recognise the importance for both National Health colleagues and also social care. But we also are key workers in the system, and we are very keen to make sure that we have a positioning within the testing regime and prioritisation. At the moment, we've been given no indication as to when the testing will take place. We understand that from the NPCC that orders have gone in for tests to come through, and there'll be a number of tests available for critical roles, but we're still waiting for definitive numbers and timescales around that.
So the police has done some ordering of testing?
That is my understanding, is that orders have gone in, and we're hopeful during the course of this month the tests will start being made available for the police service.
And who have they been ordered from, and what kinds of tests are Are they antibody tests, or are they the current infection, the swab tests?
My understanding is that they are the current tests to test whether you have the disease in your system.
And do you know who they've been ordered from?
No, I'm afraid I don't know where they've been ordered from.
Okay. Simon Kempton?
I don't know where they've been ordered from, but I'm aware of some really welcome innovative practice. NPOC are looking to repurpose, if they can, some of our existing laboratory network, forensic science service, to try and build up that the amount of tests that we can process. But even then, even if we're able to do that, there's going to be some really difficult decisions about which officers get the tests and which don't, or which get them first and which have to wait. And one of the jobs of my senior colleagues is going to have to be to manage that effect that it might have on my colleagues. And again, we need to be really clear and really honest in our communication with my colleagues, so that their expectations are met and you know, we meet the promises that we give them.
And have you been given any timetable, any indication of the timetable for that?
My expectation is that we'll begin to see those tests coming online middle to the end of April. So not long now, but still it's an anxious wait.
Okay, Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just to echo the Chair's sentiments, thank you both for joining us this afternoon. I know it'll be a very busy time for you both. You've both touched on PPE as a concern for your members. We are hearing from senior officers that PPE is available. However, picking up also anxieties from police officers on the front line that PPE isn't always readily available, and that the advice is it's not always necessary for day-to-day routine policing. Is that the feedback that you are getting from your members? Perhaps the Sergeant Kempton first. Thank
you. You're right. On behalf of the Federation, I've undertaken quite a wide piece of work on this to temperature check what the true picture of PPE is across the country. And I know that police, UK policing, has taken possession of a huge amount of PPE. I also know from what my members tell me, and also from what I've seen, only last week I was on an arrest inquiry for somebody who's known to be violent, suspected of having Covid-19. And my colleague and I didn't have the PPE when we went to make that arrest inquiry. So we know that it's in the system, but we know it's not getting to all of our colleagues. So that tells me in the middle here, something's gone wrong, whether it's with the supply chain or with local management. And what some of my early indications are, is that on a very localized level, we need to be really, really careful. We need to be much better at managing our stocks of PPE. To give you an anecdotal example, a big box of PPE comes into a police station and the officers coming off their duty and they'll take a couple of masks, some bottles of sanitizer, some goggles, and then they'll go to their next call, as you'd expect. But when the late shift come in or the night shift, that PPE isn't there anymore. So even within a very localized area, if you ask those officers, do you have the PPE? You'll get a different answer, because we need to really lock down that localized control.
So what we're picking up, particularly through our relationship with MPCC and MPOC that are coordinating a lot of this, is there definitely is energy and focus around this. There certainly were a few teething problems around the distribution to forces early on, but the concern is the distribution within forces to making sure that it reaches the officers who are actually dealing with the daily contact with potential COVID victims. The second issue is a wider issue around the supply chains. And I know the service is working hard to make sure that supply chains are there to keep the feed for PPE continuing and going for the weeks and months ahead. But it remains a concern with the demand that's going on by many agencies, health colleagues and social care and others, that we could potentially run short in terms of the number of PPE availability.
Thank you. And another aspect of the question, I apologise, I didn't answer it. It's around conflicting guidance and conflicting advice and how that might have frustrated the policing efforts to get the right PPE in place. My colleagues in MPOC tell me that there's been some confusion with different advice from PHE and HSE, and how that might have borne confusion and fed confusion into the PPE guidance that has then gone down to officers. And over the weekend, a huge amount of work was put into getting some really good guidance to officers But even then, even this morning, we're seeing that there's a conflict in some of the advice. And that's one area where perhaps we need to get to the bottom of that very, very quickly, so that my operational colleagues know that they've got the best possible advice that they can follow clearly.
Okay, and are you satisfied that you're getting a hearing from the Home Office when you're feeding on behalf of your members some of these concerns back to them? And can I also, just before we move on, I've been appalled to see some of the examples of arrests and charges relating to those coughing deliberately on officers, then saying that they've got COVID-19. Are you satisfied that you've got the support of the CPS and the courts in prosecuting those individuals?
Broadly, on your second question, broadly speaking, I am. We've seen some, what I would say, superb sentences being handed down. The crime of spitting or biting somebody, it's terrible at the best of times. But during this crisis, when COVID-19 is being weaponised against my colleagues, it heightens that fear. Because when you're dealing with somebody with a knife or other sort of weapon, someone trying to punch you, you know that once you've dealt with that situation, the danger's over and then you can go home. COVID-19 is different because you don't know if you're taking that foe home with you. And that's why weaponising COVID-19 is so reprehensible. So I'm really grateful that we've seen some very, very strong sentences, perhaps on the back of the work that even some committee members have done and wider Parliament have done on the Protect the Protectors work. But still only this morning, I won't go into the case obviously, but a colleague of mine from a northern force last week was racially abused and spat at by a member of the public who then, whilst being processed through custody, said, "I've got COVID-19. And unfortunately, on this occasion, that hasn't been charged as an aggravated offence because of the COVID-19, something I'm trying to get to the bottom of today.
I think it's worth saying that the vast majority of the public have been absolutely supportive of the police, and we need to put it in perspective, but there are extreme and vile behaviours going on in relation to coughing and spitting, and I can only reiterate what Simon said in terms of strong sentences are being issued, and we're really supportive of that, and to continue to send that message out that this is really unacceptable behaviour. On the point of raising PPE with the Home Office and Home Secretary, I had a meeting by telephone on Tuesday with her and stressed the importance of this for our members to make sure the whole of the police service has sufficient quantities, availability of PPE, and that was well recognised, well appreciated, and I'm confident that the energy and drive is there from the Home Office and the Home Secretary.
Thank you very much.
Please convey our support to any officers who have faced those appalling and unacceptable crimes against them in those circumstances. Can I just ask quickly on the PPE, that what is your estimate of the proportion of officers going out to response calls or to arrest somebody who do not have the appropriate PPE?
Chair, I'm afraid I have to give you quite an unhelpful answer because it's such a disparate picture across the country. So I've spoken to colleagues in some force areas and every single one of them has PPE available, whether it's on their person or in their vehicle. Other parts of the country, they're telling me that they're having to share PPE amongst a group of officers. Some of that's down to the supply chain, some of that's down to, again, going back to the innovative practices that have been adopted in some places but not. Some forces have adopted what they call COVID cars. So any COVID-19 related incident, they'll send a vehicle that definitely has the PPE with it, just to try and put that protection in. But unfortunately, some of my colleagues simply don't have the PPE, even this far into the crisis.
Paul Griffiths?
Yeah, I don't think we've got the data collection that's sharp enough to actually identify the proportions at the moment, but we can certainly put that inquiry back to MPOC and try and deliver you a written reply.
That would be really helpful because I think we need to know what the scale is of the problem here. And I think the other thing it would be helpful for you to perhaps come back to us on is the extent to which actually you need an oversupply in each area. If you're going to have inevitably some distribution problems or sometimes where different shifts will need different levels of PPE, surely you're going to need an oversupply in each area to make sure that you've got a buffer, so make sure that you've got enough as and when you need it in case you suddenly need more.
Yes, certainly, and I do get the fact that the forces have indicated their sort of requirements under PPE, and that relationship with MPOC in terms of the supply chain is in place. But to actually gauge the amount of officers that may be devoid of the equipment that they may need, we haven't quite got the data on that. So I will try and get you a written response in relation to that.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Chair. Like the Chair, I just also wish to acknowledge and to thank the various forces for having to respond and be versatile at this time of a national crisis to do with coronavirus. Obviously, the legislation came into force on the 26th of March, and I can see there's two briefings that I have in front of me from the College of Police and the one from also from the NPCC. And I'm just wondering, what sort of like training have frontline officers received, both present officers and retired officers coming back in PCSOs as well, and in terms as well as the ability to enforce the government's latest legislation. And maybe if Paul Griffiths could ask that first.
Yes, certainly, no problem. Well, the pace and scale by which this change in the law came in was triggered by the Prime Minister's announcement, and that probably started a social behaviour by the police to try and enforce, the policy intent of the government quite early on, even before the legislation had gone through Parliament. It was a clear need to try and enforce social distancing to try and safeguard the spread of the disease. We then worked really hard with the Home Office and the Police Powers Unit for the next 48 hours to influence in the best way possible the practicalities of trying to introduce legislation to achieve this policy intent. And we gave advice in terms of the practical issues that need to be considered, and had the opportunity to consider the draft legislation to offer any views from a practicality perspective. Upon the introduction of that advice, very quickly the NPCC and the college moved to try and create guidance to best inform officers. But actually, most officers were starting to try and influence the behaviour of the public based on the Prime Minister's announcement. Usually, we have plenty of time to bring legislation in, consult, engage, and work with parliamentarians as the law goes through Parliament. But this was a quick, swift, and directive where we had to move very quickly to try and resolve issues and work together with the public to try and keep the social distancing. So since the legislation has been introduced, there has been efforts across the whole service to introduce the guidance and do training on a force-by-force basis. But it has been introduced at a pace and at a scale that we've never experienced before.
And Simon Kempton?
Thank you. I guess the briefings you're talking about are two PowerPoints, one's that mainly black and red and one that's blue and green.
Yes, indeed.
So your question was, what training have we received, and that is the training that we've received. To echo Paul's point, first with the regulations, and then swiftly afterwards, the legislation was introduced so quickly, and there can be no criticism of Parliament in this. Parliament needed to act, and Parliament did act. But under normal circumstances, there'd be a process where we can get the training in place so that we're all trained up before the legislation lands. It was the other way around on this occasion. So we had a period of time, several days, where actually our only briefing was the very clear, very stark guidance that ministers and other government officials were giving to the public. So my colleagues on the ground, we were left in the position of understanding that this is so important. We see our job at the moment as protecting NHS, so the NHS can protect the rest of us. So it's so important we follow this guidance, but we didn't at that time have anything in writing. And that might have led to some of the inconsistencies in approach, perhaps. What we've seen since then, and I have to say the College of Policing have been very, very good in engaging with the Police Federation, some of my colleagues and I, We've seen this guidance, which I hope you'll agree is fairly clear, relatively concise and easy to follow, and that's been disseminated to all officers. One of the things that we're going to have to consider for returning officers, retirees, is making sure that they're up to date, not just with everything else that's evolved in policing, body-worn video and changes to the arrest conditions, but also this newest block of legislation. Because at the minute, we're in the middle of this pandemic, and it's scary and it's unprecedented, but it's going to end. And when it ends, the public are going to emerge, and it's going to be a very different world. They'll have lost their jobs, their businesses, and they're going to need protecting by the police at that point. And we can best protect them, not just through having the right equipment, but maintaining that relationship. I'm really proud of the relationship we have with the public. And what we need to do is get that balance of protecting the NHS whilst protecting that relationship with the public. That's where this guidance is so key.
Thank you.
Aris?
Yes, thank you. I think perhaps I'll start with Simon. Simon, if you had to identify the single biggest or the 2 or 3 biggest obstacles to effectively discharging your duties under the new powers, what would they have been?
The first thing I'd have to say is the vast majority of the public get it. They understand why this is so important, and it's inconvenient, and would rather it wasn't the case, but they get it and they want to comply and they want to help, they want to do their bit. But there are still a minority of members of the public who simply do not wish to comply with the restrictions. And we saw over the weekend with the nice weather, some of my colleagues having a monumental task, 1 or 2 officers to empty a park with hundreds of people in it. And most of those individuals wanted to argue their case as to why they were doing something within the guidelines. What would help, perhaps, is engaging the public on an emotional level, so more of them wanted to comply. Not just that they felt they had to comply, but they wanted to comply. And that would relieve perhaps some of the burden on my colleagues, and we'd have to deal with fewer people. As Paul says, we only go to enforcement when the other 3, we call them the 4 E's, when the other 3 E's have been exhausted. If we get that emotional engagement with the public so they want to help the collective effort, we'll have to go to enforcement far fewer occasions.
What do you think that would look like? Do you have something in mind when you say that, or are you just talking in a general sense?
I guess without being able to put more thought in it at the moment, it's a general sense, but part of the messaging at the moment is if you go out and you're breaching the regulations, you may end up with a fine or a criminal record. Within the last 24 hours, we've lost a nurse and we've lost a midwife to Covid-19. I think if the message was more around, by not going out, you're protecting these nurses, these doctors who are saving lives, that might have some more of a positive effect. I know Google have done some really interesting work where they're using their tracking to see where the take-up has been more welcome or better received. And it's broken down by town and by area. And there's some really stark differences from area to area. It's quite interesting. And things like that might help focus and when I say our, not just policing, our collective efforts to try and get some more compliance.
Paul?
Yeah, I think early on, as the law was enacted and police officers could rely on it, you did see inconsistency across different forces. And that was just the pace and scale and the training and the education and the cohesion across the service. I mean, we police by consent. The relationship with the public is so important to us. And, you know, we have got the vast majority of the public working with us and understand the principles by what we're trying to achieve. I think the police strategy around engagement, explanation and encouragement is absolutely spot on, and that enforcement is the last resort. This is about us trying to police a health issue through social distancing, and we don't want powers for power's sake. That is not the way that we police our society. So it's really important for us to spread that message more deeply. And I do concur with what Simon says around really trying to educate the public as much as possible. There's certain narratives that came out around, you know, this is not a public holiday. You know, we can't afford to for groups of people to meet in parks or on beaches, because this is how the disease spreads. So we just need to continue the communication strategy with the public so they can have a thorough understanding about what they can and they can't do under the law.
Thank you.
Ruth Edwards. Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start by reiterating the Chair's thanks to both of you, Simon and to Paul, and to your members and all police officers for the incredible work you're doing at the moment. I think we recognise that we are asking you to do a very difficult thing, which is a huge contrast to the way of life that we're used to in the United Kingdom. And I wanted to start by asking you, you mentioned how quickly that quite a large body of law has come into play. How confident do your members feel at the moment about enforcing those new laws?
You're absolutely right. And Paul touched on it earlier, the scope and the scale at which we've moved is huge. It's unprecedented. My members didn't feel confident initially, mainly because they were getting conflicting messages. And that's why you saw different areas perhaps interpreting things differently. As we've been able to really reinforce that training, as we've been able to see more and more examples of really good practice, really good policing, overtaking the narrative that was quite negative in some parts of the media and quite unfair. We saw so many areas where my colleagues were just engaging with the public, taking shopping to vulnerable people, helping people to cope and to get their heads around this incredible restriction that we've all got on us. As we've seen that start to take over the narrative as well, that's given my colleagues more confidence in applying the common sense approach. And let's not get distracted by some of the mistakes that might have been made at the beginning.
Sure. Paul Griffiths.
I think very early on, there was probably some confusion around, there was a real need for a clear and consistent message, both from the government, from police and other agencies about what this meant. And I think a lot of officers actually relied on the policy intent clearly before the law was enacted. And the policy intent was exactly what we needed under the scientific evidence to keep people apart and trying to stop the spread of this disease. But as it was introduced in terms of law, that's when we started to try and be more consistent and cohesive in terms of the messaging and guidance that was coming from MPCC and also the College of Policing. Were there mistakes? Yes, there probably were. Were there times that it could have been misinterpreted? Yes, there probably was. But actually the intent of the police service and the intent of what we're trying to achieve here was absolutely clear to everybody. It was just the nuances with understanding the particulars of the regulations and the law.
Do you think, in your opinion, has that been ironed out now, perhaps particularly amongst the public as well as officers? Because I know there are some examples, for example, government guidance is that you only leave your house once a day for exercise, but that actually isn't actually stipulated in the regulations in England, which is a potential source of confusion. Have you been finding that as a source of confusion, or have people been much more sort of willing to follow sort of instructions when they engage with your officers?
I think in a broad sense, the clarity and the fog is clearing for the police service in terms of the approach and the strategy, and also what the law means and the best way of dealing with the communities in which our officers serve. I would reiterate what I've said previously, is we need to keep the momentum going on a communication strategy with the public. We need to maintain that pressure of understanding to make sure that everybody understands what they can and they can't do, what is a reasonable excuse for leaving the home. And I think that needs to continue by all agencies.
Okay, Simon Kempton.
I could only absolutely agree. I think the government message has to be so strong because the stakes are so high, but it must be aligned to what the legislation and the regulations state, because otherwise that breeds confusion for the public, importantly, but also for me. when I do my next shift and I'm enforcing these regulations, I need to be clear in my mind so that I'm not letting the public down.
And just a last question from me along these lines. We have, that we've set out what are reasonable activities to leave home for. How do police officers verify that people are doing what they claim they are doing when they leave their home? Because obviously there are some famous examples of the gentleman who had a car full of window frames and his wife in the boot, where he fairly obviously is not leaving home to go to the supermarket or whatever. But how would you try and verify in those encounters that you have with people that people are leaving home for one of those excuses? Because it seems to me like it must be quite difficult.
You're absolutely right, and to an extent, very, very, close to being impossible. If I stop somebody on the canal towpath jogging and I engage with them as the suggestion is, as my training says, and they tell me this is my first jog of the day, I'm not likely to start following them as they jog, because you make sure they go home again. So that engagement period there, that's really vital. The explanation, because that gets the member of the public, even if it's their third jog of the day, that's where I can influence them, not today, but tomorrow. So tomorrow they'll say, well, I get it now, I'll only go for one jog. Because we don't live in a police state and none of us want to. And that verification process, that's the end of the line, that's the 4th E. What I want to do is, even if I've really caught them doing something, and even if we both know they shouldn't have done it, let's try and deal with it by education. Let's try and help them to understand so that they don't do it again.
Sure.
Thankfully, we've got a long history of engagement with the public. We've got a group of people who are very inquisitive by nature and have got the ability to communicate effectively. We know what our strategy is. We know what we've got to communicate. So we just ask the line of questioning that's necessary and the encouragement to do the right thing, which is about protecting the NHS.
Thank you. No more questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Simon Fell.
Oh, thank you, Chair. We've touched on some of this before, so the focus on the guidance being on the 4 E's. I'm wondering if you've had any specific guidance, or if you're working on specific guidance for your teams around what each of those phases entails. If I start with you, Paul.
Well, in terms of the training package that's gone out, we haven't gone into the depths of breaking down what each element means, because this has been introduced in such a swift way. But we do rely on the common sense and the ability of our teams at all levels to apply it in the way by which we've policed for hundreds of years. And that's working with the public, trying to understand the challenges that we're facing and trying to encourage them to actually isolate themselves and stop the spread of the disease. So have we broken it down? There may have been these conversations that go on in every police station, exactly what it means, but the underpinning theory by which we're approaching it is well understood by the service.
Thank you. Simon.
Paul's absolutely correct in what he says, but to give some reassurance, almost hot off the press, just this morning, the College of Policing sent me some further guidance around the regulations and the legislation. The Act is obviously different from the legislation, from the regulations. So this extra training, this extra explanation of the 4 E's, that is going to be disseminated as well.
Thank you. And just following up from that, are you comfortable that the sort of escalation through those phases is consistent across forces and it's being applied in the same way? So I'll go back to you, Simon.
It's a really good question. It's impossible, if they take the hundreds of thousands of encounters that we'll have with the public every single day, it's impossible to take that one regulation and apply it in the same way, because it's so many variables. And part of that variable is how the member of public approaches the regulations from their side. Broadly speaking, now that we've got these training packages in place, we're seeing far more consistency. What we need next that would help my operational colleagues to go with the consistent training is the consistent message that goes with that training. So the public are being asked to comply with the regulations that are there that we're able to enforce, that we're able to engage around, rather than something that's perhaps more aspirational.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, obviously, just to reiterate Simon's stance on this, we were aware of some misinterpretations of the law early on. We probably didn't get it all right first time, but the reality is that a letter went out from the chair of the NPCC to all chief constables, appealing for consistency in terms of approach. That, underpinned by the strategy, underpinned by the guidance, is certainly getting us into a better position in terms of trying to police what is a really tricky piece of legislation.
Okay, thank you. Can I just pick up on that point around consistent messaging, if I may? Where do you think that should be focused from, and who do you think should be leading on it? Sorry, Simon, you raised it, so I'll go to you.
So as a police service, it's not our job to interpret, it's our job to enforce the legislation that was given to us by Parliament. So I see the job of government, of the Home Office, to set the direction underpinned by the correct regulations and the correct legislation. And then that for chief officers, it's their role to give my colleagues that very, very clear guidance and training. So it must go in that direction. And that's the way we get the consistency across the UK. We lose that consistency if we don't take that top-down approach to what the message should be. That's my opinion.
And is your view that we're heading in the right direction there, or is there more work to be done?
There's always more work to be done, because I'm a perfectionist in how I do my role. My colleagues agree. We always want to be better. And if I make a mistake, and I'm well capable of making a mistake, I want to reflect on that and not repeat it. But if you look at the number of negative encounters, negative stories, just over the last week, we're seeing far more positive view of the police as we become more comfortable with the regulations. I mean, I've been in the police for 20 years now. When I was at Hendon 20 years ago, nobody trained me in how to police a global pandemic with restrictions on movement, the like we didn't even see during the Second World War. So when I go out and do my shifts alongside my colleagues, I'm learning at the same time. But I am learning, which means I'm going to make less mistakes or fewer mistakes than I might have done a week ago. So it is getting much, much better. And that's reflected in the way that we're being positively encouraged by the public. The public want to see us, by and large. It's only the tiny minority that are letting the rest of it down.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And Paul?
Yeah, just from a police point of view, clearly it's the senior leaders that have got the responsibility to get that communication and approach and strategy right and get that communicated out. But in terms of the public, I think we've all got a duty. I think we've all got a responsibility as individuals in terms of our agencies, and all of the public sector agencies need to be on the same sheet in terms of really pushing the communication advice to stop spreading this disease.
Deanna Davidson.
The guidance that's come out from the NPCC, and I understand that there were specifically some bits in that guidance with regards to encouraging compliance amongst young people. So I just wondered what you thought the specific challenges were there, and also what strategies you think we should have in place in order to combat that. Sorry, I'll go to Simon first.
I apologise. I think your mic wasn't turned on for the very beginning, but I think I understand what you're saying. The younger part of our community are going to perhaps reflect differently on these regulations than other parts, particularly during half term. They're used to being able, it's gorgeous weather, they're used to being able to go out, and suddenly they've got these restrictions. And one of the things actually that we've had to ensure that we're across is whether or not these restrictions might cause tension within households. You know, and the potential for domestic violence or abuse situations within the households with different age groups. I think one of the things that we need to recognise is there's no one-size-fits-all message here when we talk to the public. And what might work for me with my frame of reference might not work for my daughter. My daughter's 21 years old, and she's got a very different outlook on life than I do when it comes to socialising with friends. So some of the messaging from government has been really impactful and fantastic, but it might not work on all sections of the community. So I think what we need to do is engage with them and say, well, what would work with you? We've got groups around the country that the government and other agencies can tap into specifically to help understand each other. Use those networks and help them to formulate and influence the communication strategy.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, it's certainly true that the relationship between the police and the youth is really vital. And, you know, from my perspective, the importance and the frustrations they may be going through at the moment, as Simon's just reiterated, we do recognise it. There are an awful lot of police officers are parents and really do understand the frustrations of children and the youth in terms of the restrictions that they are under at the moment. I do think there needs to be more about what other purposes we can encourage them to engage in, what they can do online, what they can do in terms of their development, what they can do in terms of their physical fitness, their mental fitness. There must be more that we can do in terms of the government to try and engage the youth in activities which sadly are indoors, but can keep them going in terms of their purpose and keep them entertained or keep them engaged and keep them off the streets.
Thank you. And sort of similarly, we know that social media is particularly used amongst our younger generations, but have you specifically noticed any kind of increased reporting of people breaking the regulations through social media? I don't know, for example, by posting a video of them out and about. If I go to you first, Paul.
Yeah, I have to say, I haven't personally seen any increase in breaches of the regulations through social media, but it's certainly something that we can look into if that's an indicator or warning signal for us to start thinking about how we engage better with the youth.
Thank you. And Simon?
If you'll forgive me and allow me, I'll go off on a slight tangent. It's built on something that Paul said earlier. More and more of our young people are inside on their different devices. And I think one thing that policing has to keep across is the increased potential for them to be subject to online grooming and those sorts of offences. And while it's absolutely right that we put our effort and our resources into enforcing the regulations, protecting the NHS, at the same time, the balancing act for chief officers is to make sure we don't take our eye off these balls as well, because somewhere somebody will take advantage of the situation for their own ends.
Thank you. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for all that you and your members are doing. And it was really brought home to me. I witnessed the aftermath of a really terrible road traffic collision with a fatality just near where I live the other day on a visit to the shops, and the amount of police having to deal with that situation on top of all their other responsibilities, I think brings home, you know, the challenges that you're facing. So thank you to all of you and all of your members. I wanted to ask some specific questions about domestic abuse. You'll have seen the reporting today from Refuge that calls are up 25% to them since the lockdown started, and that visits to the UK-wide National Domestic Abuse website are up 150% compared to the same period last year. Can you say a little bit about what your members are feeding back to you about the increased incidence of domestic abuse and how they're responding to those cases?
I don't have the same overview clearly that the Chiefs Council will have and the Home Office, because obviously the Home Office collate these figures. So I can only give you the frontline view, which is clearly going to be more anecdotal. And it's a different picture across the country. But one thing that is difficult for my colleagues is under normal circumstances, there might be two of us turn up to a domestic abuse situation and we try and deal with it in a set way. We'll separate the parties. But one of the things that's different here is sometimes because of staffing or because of coronavirus restrictions on our own social distancing, we might not have a colleague with us. So that might make it more difficult to deal with some of these incidents in some places. And one of the things that we have to really, going back to the 4Es, when we're dealing with somebody who's maybe out of the house and we're worried that maybe they're breaching the regulations, one of the things that is the forefront of my colleagues' minds is maybe they're escaping some sort of abuse situation. So we need to remember we can't just necessarily send them home and think we've done our job, because maybe we're sending them back to a dangerous situation. So COVID-19, it's brought a really a difficult aspect to every part of our work. And reflecting on what you've just said about the road traffic collision, that's just another aspect of this. This isn't business as usual, but our day job goes on alongside COVID-19. We've got to do all of the other things that we always would. And that just increases the burden on my colleagues, of course.
Yeah, you've raised a really good point, is that albeit that the demand has gone down in terms of some of the calls, the crimes and the incidents, the reality is day-to-day policing does continue. It's just this additionality of trying to deal with the social space type issues through the new powers that we've got. In terms of the vulnerability issues, I've been a big advocate of promoting and encouraging victims of vulnerability to take a step forward and seek help. And that is the big fear of most of our members, is the usual regular contact that vulnerable people have in the main has been taken away, leaving them even more prone or vulnerable to any sorts of crimes of this nature. So it really is on the risk register around domestic abuse and child sexual abuse and some of the harm and risk to the vulnerable people out there. I think it's down to how we reach out to them, how we communicate to them. Our ability to communicate has got to probably focus on the main communication lines into them, either through television, social media, traditional media, and make sure that those helplines we react to, we still provide a service and a good service for people who flag up vulnerability issues. And we're still there to help people, and we need to make sure that message gets out to people.
Paul, you just mentioned child sexual abuse and obviously other forms of abuse against children and young people. Of course, you know, the assumption, if you're seeing teenagers and young people out and about, you know, congregating together or perhaps not seem to be following the rules, that, you know, they're doing something wrong. But of course, some of them may be escaping very difficult home situations. Can you just say a little bit more about what specific training and guidance is being given to your members about identifying those cases and ensuring, you know, officers throughout the command chain are able to give the right advice to young people in particular?
Well, we've had a lot of training and education over the last few years around vulnerability, and our focus is really on making sure the risk harm threat that's out there in our communities is monitored, controlled, supported, engaged, and make sure that we actually reach out to those victims and bring them to safety and try and support them in the best way we can. So much of the vulnerability training has been really effective across the whole of England and Wales in the last few years. So officers will be acutely aware of their responsibilities in relation to vulnerability. We haven't seen any data yet in terms of any trend data to do with vulnerability crimes, but those indicators through helplines, etc., are a warning signal to us all that we just need to keep the focus on people who may be out there who might be able to reach help, because we are still there to help people.
Fantastic. And can I ask a specific question about mental health to both of you, I guess from both the perspective of dealing with increased mental health incidents? I mean, the police, we've regularly found on the committee over the last few years, have become a bit of a last resort for dealing with people with mental health difficulties, often serious ones. But given some of the things you said about, for example, not being able to staff calls in the usual ways, perhaps have the other supportive organisations there, what steps are being taken both in order to support people who are perhaps been, you know, triggered or got into serious difficulties as a result of being isolated, but also to protect officers in those situations, and indeed them dealing with the consequences themselves of you know, some very difficult circumstances?
So we're still waiting to see the sort of data on some of the mental health incidents that we may still be, well, which we will still be dealing with. But anecdotally, we're getting from members is there's starting to be a slight increase. And forward looking, if we continue to keep these isolating strategies in place, there is a risk that mental health issues will increase over the coming weeks and months. So, you know, we're well versed with what our role is in terms of supporting members of the community in terms of their mental health challenges. working with other agencies such as health, social care and local authorities. And so it's a well-trodden path in terms of what we can do to maximise the support for those individuals who are probably going to see increased and more intense pressure in terms of their well-being.
And Simon, are you picking up similar from your members?
I am, and at a very operational level, forces are looking to make sure that they've got specialist resource. So hostage and crisis negotiators would often be a first port of call for perhaps someone who's in crisis contemplating suicide, to make sure that even during COVID-19, that those cadres are there and can be called upon by an operational commander. One of the difficulties we've got is, as police service is losing staff to abstractions through self-isolation or sickness, so are the mental health services, so are the social services. And it's going to be all too easy for some of these people in real crisis to fall through the gaps as we see those staffing levels start to come under more and more burden. It's something that we can't lose sight of.
And do you think overall that the system is coping at the moment, but that there's a risk as potentially, the lockdown continues, that real pressures could come to bear and that people would fall through the cracks, as you're suggesting?
You've hit the nail on the head. At the moment, we are coping, but we are starting to see in some areas, particularly specialist areas, that burden's starting to grow as we lose staff. But I think you're absolutely right. It's going to be absolutely vital that we keep an eye on that. And the very, very early indications of an increase in suicide attempts and suicides, far too early to say that that's a real trend, but there's very early indications of that. And as you so rightly said, quite often the police are the agency who end up dealing and trying to deal with that situation.
Yeah, and can I just ask on that last point, what you just said about suicide? I mean, that would obviously be deeply concerning, but perhaps not surprising in the circumstances. And what support is there for your members who are potentially having to deal with those situations? Because I'm aware of what police have to deal with on a regular basis. I mean, I know of an officer, locally who'd had to deal with 3 in one day some time ago. What support is there for them having to deal with, their own reactions to those situations, particularly with all the other pressures they're having to deal with?
I mean, it's a great question. This feeds into some of the innovative processes that I mentioned earlier. Some forces have introduced the gold command structure specifically for welfare, because we know suicide, absolutely, but we know that if this outbreak continues in the way that the scientific and the medical advice suggests, my colleagues, we're going to be dealing with an increase in dead bodies, for example, which is traumatic and over time will take its toll. The police service have got measures in place, but because of the last 10 years and austerity cuts, all too often the occupational health services are not as well stocked, shall we say, as they used to be. The Police Federation has tried to at least help with that gap. We've got our welfare support programme, and branches around the country do a huge amount of work on the ground floor. But we need to recognise, my colleagues, over the next several weeks, we're going to be going through some really traumatic times, and we need to make sure when we come out the other side into the recovery phase that we've got a well-functioning police service that can then pick up the society and take us through the next phase so that we don't completely collapse.
And one last technical point on that.
I need to think, we're tight for time, sorry. Tim Lawton.
Can you hear me? Fine. Can I reiterate what colleagues have said? I think it's incumbent upon us as lawmakers to absolutely back up the police and the enforcement of the law in this unprecedented time as well. And every platform we have, be it this or through social media, certainly we should be doing that. Can I, there's 2 things I want to ask. Firstly, can I just come back very quickly, Sergeant Kempton, about people deliberately coughing and then claiming they've got COVID. Have you got access to spit hoods, or whatever the technical term was? Because there was some controversy about a year or so ago about whether they should be used or not. Are they being brought into use for this purpose now as well, regretfully?
Every single force has got access to spit guards. Some forces still only use them in the custody environment. Now, my plea to forces has always been, we need those on the street as well, because I've got just as much chance of being spat at on the street as I have in custody. And it's an emotive one for me, because I've had other people's blood in my mouth after they've spat at me. Now more than ever, while COVID-19 is being weaponised, we need those spit guards in the pocket of every single police officer, not just in custody, but on the street as well. And we've got some really tight guidelines about where they can be used, how they can be used. There's a huge amount, quite rightly, of oversight and accountability. Now that that reassurance is there, every one of my colleagues deserves to have that spit guard, particularly while COVID-19 is being weaponised.
So are you saying they're not available, but absolutely you can use them, but they're not as available as they need to be, particularly now as an alternative form of PPE, effectively?
In some areas they are. So in my force area, Dorset, I've got a personal issue spit guard. When I go out on patrol, that's in my bag or in my pocket. Some areas of the country are still only using them in the custody environment. So they are being issued, but only for use within custody.
Okay. Superintendent Griffiths, you said earlier about the changes in demand of policing, and obviously things are being completely turned upside down. On the plus side, you're dealing with fewer road traffic accidents, presumably at the moment. You're dealing with fewer pub brawls, hopefully, and fewer home burglaries, although conversely, you're probably going to have retail premises that have been burgled and people don't know about until they go back after the lockdown is lifted. And then we've heard about the increase in domestic violence and other cybercrime. How do those two balance out in terms of whether the extra capacity you've got from things you're not, conventional things you're not having to pursue, overtaken by what you are now having to do? And also that in the context of what are the absenteeism rates of police because they are self-isolating or they've been infected as well? Because we seem to hear anecdotal evidence that the police have been more affected than other part of the public services. Is that true?
Okay, you're right to raise the issue that demand is changing somewhat. Normal policing does continue. So whilst there has been a drop that we're picking up from members around calls of service, crime and incidents, and arrest rates and detentions, actually the capacity is being consumed by a desire and necessity to police the public space and enforce the law around social distancing. So, but then you underpin that with the capacity of the service, and we are obviously experiencing an absence rate. The absence rate is approximately 13% across the whole of the national establishment, and that includes police officers and staff. Some of those will be sick, some of those will be self-isolating because of symptoms, and some of them will have caring responsibilities. Most of them are trying as best as possible to see whether they can work at home, which gives you an idea of the solidarity that continues across the police service in trying to do their very best under extreme circumstances. So with that capacity issue, ironically, none of the police forces are flagging up anything that they can't cope with at this stage. But this is a daily monitoring of the situation as more and more people get infected with this disease.
I'm just trying to put this into context. So that 13%, yeah. How does that differ to normal anticipated absence rates amongst the police force? Just as we are trying to assess the capacity still within the National Health Service to deal with the increase in admissions, it'll be useful to get an idea of what capacity there is now, because if the lockdown has to be tightened, so if the education and engaged role of those two E's becomes more about enforcement, more about issuing penalties to people who are grouping outside, more about clamping down on additional exercise, if it comes to that, then just how far stretched are you going to be, not dealing with the road traffic accidents and everything else, but now having to deal with a lot more? Where are we on that scale at the moment, do you think? And how long's a piece of string, I know, but just give your assessment.
So I'm not sure what the national average sickness rate or absence rate is. So I'll have to get back to you in terms of the exact figure. But I can confirm that no forces are obviously got absence rates, but they're not highlighting risk at this stage in terms of the service provision. So in terms of projection, it is plateauing off in terms of the absence rate at the moment. But we are acutely aware that this could change and could change rapidly at any point. So this is a daily monitoring of the situation. And quite frankly, we don't know what the impact will be if this disease continues to spread, particularly into members of the police family.
So, Sergeant Kempton, a comment from you, and also, are we effectively seeing reprioritisation of some of your conventional policing roles at the moment? And are we also seeing, I think it's the case in my force in Sussex, with talks with the Commissioner, that those in training are having their training expedited and getting out onto the street perhaps sooner than they might have done to help with the increase in demand?
You're absolutely right. So the College of Policing have worked with the Police Federation and NPCC in the Home Office, and they've created an abridged syllabus to give new recruits the basic skills they need to keep themselves, their colleagues and the public safe. And then once the outbreak is past, they'll revisit some of the other areas. So for example, they'll be given Theft Act, Public Order Act training, because that's vital, that's every day. And then later on, we can look at the Fraud Act and more in depth. And then making sure that even though they've had training, that they're with a more qualified colleague who's got at least 2 years service. And that's important because as we start to lose staff through abstractions, we're going to need as many officers as possible. So that's why we've supported giving that abridged training as a pragmatic answer to a crisis. In terms of the capacity of the police service, at the moment, we can cope, we are coping, but that's going to become more difficult as the abstraction rate rises. And what we might see then, by necessity, is chief officers reprioritising some areas above others. 3 areas that we absolutely cannot allow to fall too low: armed policing, because we must have an armed policing response, terrorist events, armed crime, investigation of crime where maybe there's a danger of losing evidence that we can't park, and then effectively answering 999 calls, as long as it's obviously an appropriate 999. We must protect those areas. But even during this conversation, we touched on other areas that are really important: protection of children online, for example, protection of domestic abuse victims. So for my colleagues, really difficult to do that work, and for chief officers, really difficult to manage those priorities.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I once again just convey our thanks to both of you for giving your evidence and for your time, for the work that you are doing, but also for the work that police officers and staff and all of your members are doing right across the country on all of the work that you are doing to keep us safe. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our second panel to give evidence. So I'd ask everybody to bear with us while we just sort the technology of switching from one panel to the second. And while we are doing so, we will have with us Chief Constable Lisa Winward from North Yorkshire Police, Chief Constable Garry Forsyth from Bedfordshire Police, Chief Constable Peter Goodman from Derbyshire Police, and Chief Constable John Robbins from West Yorkshire Police. I would once again to our second panel convey our huge thanks to all of you, to your forces, and to all of your staff and officers for all of the work that you are doing, not just to implement the regulations, but also to keep your communities safe much more widely. Can I begin by asking each of you in turn an opening question, but then as we follow through with subsequent questions, we'd ask, obviously, we are very grateful to have 4 Chief Constables with us today, but also ask you not to follow up if you have nothing to add to what another Chief Constable may already have said in your responses, but simply to add further additional information as well, so we can cover as many of these important topics as possible. But can I begin by just asking each of you in turn to tell us what your overall experience has been of policing the new regulations in the coronavirus crisis, what your assessment is of the overall level of adherence to the regulations, and also where things have worked well, but where you are facing problems. And can I start with Chief Constable Lisa Winward?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair and Committee. So the overarching feeling from this unprecedented health crisis has been that it's been very fast moving. We have very experienced local resilience forums and critical incident structures already in place and well practiced for these sorts of incidents. So we found that it was very helpful to come together with partners who we already work with longer term, and we run tabletop exercises, and we have practiced for pandemic type situations. So we found that due to those existing relationships, those teams of people have been brought together very quickly. In terms of the challenges, the partnership approach, this being an unprecedented health crisis, is very unusual. Most of our critical incidents are police-led, and therefore it's vitally important that this is a partnership approach and that we are putting health and saving lives at the forefront of this particular incident that we face. I think the difficulty has been the legislation being passed very quickly. In normal circumstances, that legislation would be discussed in depth over time between the Home Office, key stakeholders, guidance and training be afforded before it's actually out there being used in a public space. So I think the greatest challenge has been trying to get that learning, best practice, interpretation out into the public space so that our officers and staff can learn from best practice and implement it in a way that is proportionate and necessary, and absolutely not move away from our engagement style, which we very much value in the British Police Service, of that relationship we already have with the public, and we don't want to damage that.
Thank you. Chief Constable Garry Forsyth.
Yes, good afternoon, Chair, and can I add my thanks to yourself and the committee for giving us the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I'd just like to express thanks as well for the positive sentiment that's been conveyed in the earlier session. That makes such a huge difference to our officers and staff to know that we've got the support of our politicians at such a testing moment in time. So thank you all for that. Just in terms of the general feeling, from the workforce perspective, I have to say the workforce feeling is really incredible. It's been, a brilliant response by our emergency service officers and staff to get us to the position where we're in. And actually, from the community perspective as well, there's an extremely high level of support for the work that we're doing across the organisation. And as Lisa's already mentioned, the policing by consent that we enjoy in this country and that we rely upon to police effectively is so important and so dear to us, and that's something we have focused very heavily on here in Bedfordshire as well. So we focus specifically on the engage, explain and encourage elements of the 4 E's over the first week for two factors. Firstly, because we do have very strong relationships with our communities and we wanted to maintain that and indeed take the opportunity to build on it with the right messaging of supporting the NHS and saving lives, but also because we weren't in a position to actually issue any enforcement until Friday last week. So there's dual factors in that. But the compliance that we've seen through the approach that we've taken has been very, very good and very, very positive. There are minor occasions that we've seen over the course of the weekend, a few limited occasions where people aren't complying with the guidance, but then when they are engaged with and spoken to, they are then choosing to move on and comply with the guidance at that point. And I think then moving on to the challenges aspect of it, I think one of the biggest challenges of this has been trying to match the need for pace with the need for consistency across the country. And I think we did see some of the challenges which I know were articulated very well by Simon and Paul earlier on in the earlier session. But I think that has undoubtedly been a challenge, and it did feel a little difficult at the outset. But I think the unprecedented nature of these events and the speed at which policing and indeed all public servants and the rest of the other sectors as well have responded to that means that it's created some challenges. But I think we're in a better space now, and the public are adjusting to that as they become more informed and more educated over that period of time as well. But undoubtedly a challenge has been almost the pace versus consistency.
Thank you. Chief Constable Peter Goodman.
Good afternoon. Again, thank you for the opportunity. And can I just again place on record, as I'm sure my colleagues would as well, our gratitude to our National Health Service for the brilliant job that they're doing at this time. And secondly, can I again place on record my gratitude for the brilliant job that all the emergency services are doing, including the police service at the front line at this time. I don't want to say too much that my colleagues have said already, other than to say our experience so far is that the public are behaving absolutely brilliantly in relation to this across the whole of Derbyshire and beyond. Some examples of that is we can remember right at the start of this crisis, we had swathes of people going to Derbyshire, going to the Peak District. Well, frankly, that's disappeared. And that's disappeared because the public are working with us. I think everybody realises these are unprecedented times and everybody is pulling together. In terms of the challenges, for us, there is a challenge around absence, which is different to what we've had before. We think it's about 10% extra that we're facing here. But at the same time, some of the demands on our services have gone down, which means we are able to cope with some of that. And I think one of the important things that we all need to think about as we move forward is how do we keep the messages fresh with the public? How do we make sure that when we carry out our strategy, our 4E strategy, that we're doing it in a way that means that the message is still fresh, the message is still meaningful, and people don't forget about it, or people don't think it's less important with every day that passes. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief Constable John Robbins.
Good afternoon. Starting with the challenges, quite simply policing these new restrictions in a way that maintains public confidence in policing and at the same time protects the NHS has been the key challenges we've seen over the last couple of weeks. I suppose our second challenge locally is protecting the public, protecting people from harm in what's a new policing environment in terms of domestic abuse, child sexual exploitation, fraud, cyber-related crime. So we're having to adapt and change the way in which we're policing to ensure we're still protecting vulnerable people. And then thirdly, as was mentioned earlier in the earlier evidence, was around communications. Around communications internally within the organisation to get the right message at the right time to the right staff, but also externally with the public to help explain what we're doing, why we have to do these things, and what our new policing style is. In terms of adherence, we were very fortunate, and I'm pleased to report that adherence across West Yorkshire has been very good, and I do thank the public of West Yorkshire for that. And I think Chief Constables up and down the country have seen that on a national level. Despite some of the early difficult few days as we all settled into this, I think as a society across the United Kingdom, we've seen very good adherence, and that's helped us, helped the NHS, and helped the whole society respond to this. I suppose lastly, I think you touched on in the few questions you asked around what's worked well. For us, technology's worked really well about a mobile, agile, digitally enabled environment, enabled us to continue policing. I think nationally, the National Police Chiefs Council coordination under NPOC has worked really well as well. And that's seen us getting a consistent and clear approach as we've gone forward. And I think the support of the Home Office and what we've been doing more recently has also worked well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I welcome the points that all of you have made about the high levels of adherence to the guidance across the country. Can I just ask you a very factual point? How many fines have your officers issued? Chief Constable Robbins.
We've taken an approach alongside everybody else nationally around that, engaging and explaining. So we've spoken to thousands of people over the last couple of weeks and worked with them. We've then encouraged, and we've done that where people have clearly been breaching the restrictions. There's about 1,200 people we've got a record of warning. That is not enforcement. That's a record of speaking to and explaining the error of their ways. In the last 9 to 11 days since the enforcement of these regulations, we've thankfully only had to enforce 20 cases. And those cases where people are deliberately breaching this and often associated with other criminality, I have to say. But it's few and far between because we've been in that place of engagement, encouragement and explanation rather than getting to enforcement only where we have to and only where we're trying to stop the spread of the virus.
So just can I clarify, so that's in order to implement the health measures, speaking to 1,200 people and implementing 20 fines?
We've enforced only 20, yes.
Thank you. Chief Constable Goodman?
Exactly the same approach here in Derbyshire, where it's all been about engage, explain, encourage. We have found that we have had on 30 occasions to give out fixed penalty notices. Interestingly, over half of those were during the course of the last weekend when we had the better weather. And again, it's only where the first 3 E's have failed to encourage people to do the right thing that unfortunately we've had to use enforcement. But it is absolutely the last resort, and there's been no repeat enforcement either where the fixed penalty notices go up. These are all single occasions.
Garry Forsyth.
Thank you, Chair. So as I mentioned earlier on, we are one of the forces in the UK. It's an early adopter for conditional cautioning, which meant we didn't have the infrastructure in place to deliver fines up until 7 AM on Friday this week. So we were very much focused, as with other colleagues, on the engage, encourage and explain piece. Since we went live with fines on Friday at 7 AM, we issued 1 over the course of the weekend, and that's been the full extent of our issues.
Okay. And Lisa Winward.
Thank you, Chair. Likewise, we've predominantly adopted an engage, explain and encourage people. We only started to issue any enforcement on Thursday, so 4 days ago, and we've issued 11 fines during that period, but only in cases where it's been blatant disregard for what we're trying to achieve in preventing the spread of the virus.
Thank you. Can I also then ask you specifically about parks, because you'll know the concerns that have been raised about particularly urban parks and the tension between making sure people can get exercise, can support mental health and so on, especially where they don't have access to gardens and therefore becomes even more important, but also the need to maintain social distancing. We've seen the issue with Brockwell Park, where we're told that it was under police recommendation to close the park. Have any of you faced or considered issues around needing to close parks, perhaps some of your busiest urban parks? Starting with Lisa Winward.
Thank you, Chair. We experienced that very first weekend overwhelming visitors to North Yorkshire simply because of the environment in which we police. So we cover 3,300 square miles and nearly 6,000 miles of roads, and predominantly people visit us from outside of our area to our beauty spots and the coast and the city of York. We have millions of visitors. So we have found in partnership to try and discourage people, there are certain areas of our national parks that have been closed, but by those agencies rather than by the police, to try and avoid that spread of the virus. I would say, though, extremely grateful to our public here and to those who we engaged with the first week. We have seen much support this past weekend and people not visiting those areas. We're very grateful for people now heeding that advice and taking their exercise more locally and not driving for hundreds of miles to visit those beauty spots.
And I want to just sort of we'll come back to the beauty spots issue, just specifically just on the urban parks first as well. John Robbins.
Yes, in the first weekend we did see significant gatherings in parks across all of West Yorkshire and Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield, Wakefield. And again, we used that engagement approach through the course of that week, through local media, social media messages throughout. We had the benefit and the support of local authorities who took some decisions around closing parks as well. So that assisted us because it became a societal issue rather than just a policing issue. I am pleased to report that over this last weekend, we've looked at 60 of our urban parks and there hasn't been any breaches of the restrictions during this last weekend. And bearing in mind it was a particularly hot Sunday as well, that's been really beneficial to help stop the spread of the virus.
So are all your parks reopened again, or are some of them still closed?
There's a mixture across each of the districts. So some are, the majority are closed, but there's a balance because I think in each of our areas and districts, people have got ability, an opportunity to get out to get exercise on that one occasion a day for their own health and well-being. For those urban parks which were becoming a magnet for people, the local authorities, quite rightly in my view, have taken on a few occasions the decision to close them.
But what was the issue then in those parks? Was it making it that they were so crowded it was not possible to stand more than 2 meters apart from each other, that people were deliberately sort of sitting down in groups? What was it that was going against the regulations that required you to take such strong action in terms of park closures?
Across West Yorkshire, we've got a lot of residents of high density populations. We've got a lot of people who don't even have access to a garden or even a yard. So I've got an utmost sympathy with people, especially those with families and children who need to get out. The issue was people sitting, congregating, gathering, and therefore on some occasions being within 2 meters of each other, but equally not fulfilling the spirit of that one exercise a day. So of course, any family or young family out taking exercise, playing football, we wouldn't want to be enforcing that. But groups of people sitting, potentially drinking, listening to music, that's not within the spirit of the legislation on that first weekend. And nor so is it going to stop the spread of the virus. So it was, again, through education, wider engagement, and thankfully greater public advice through the government, we were able to get to a place primarily for people to take exercise in, not to sit around and take leisure time in.
So I'm still not clear what is actually happening. Are these parks still closed? Because then you made it sound as if actually, no, they're open again and now people are playing football in them or taking exercise rather than sitting down having picnics. Which is it? Are they closed, or are they now open and being used appropriately?
Forgive me, there's a mixture of parks. Some are closed and some are open for exercise, but across all 60, across all of this weekend, there wasn't any flagrant breaches of the regulations, which is the most important thing to us. So depending on local authority, they make the decision about the closure of the parks. The vast majority are closed, but there's still access to some parks for some people for exercise. Okay,
so the ones that are closed, then you said you've only issued 20 fines. Did you consider with the local authority introducing a much stronger individual enforcement approach to take enforcement action against those people who were breaching the regulations, so that you could then keep them open for other people who weren't breaching the regulations and may have had nowhere else to exercise?
Well, each local district, so for us there's 5 local authority areas, and they've all got their own command structures in place. So from a West Yorkshire policing perspective, we coordinate and oversee those. So that would be a decision made at those local gold groups between the local policing partners and the local authorities. So there's no unilateral West Yorkshire discussion about that. But those discussions will have happened locally, based with local knowledge, local people, with a local understanding what other facilities are available to them.
But you'll understand the question about whether it is possible simply to increase enforcement rather than to need to close places altogether.
I'm satisfied that there's sufficient places for people to get exercise for their own health and well-being on their trips out on one occasion a day, whilst some of these parks are closed, if that answers your question.
Even though the majority of them are now closed?
Yes, because there's still sufficient other areas where people can go, because despite it being West Yorkshire, as you well know, there's parts of the area with countryside local to people, and those people in cities and towns also have the ability to exercise in other areas. But I maintain that some of the parks are still open, they're not all closed unilaterally.
Sure. The ones that did close, did they all have police officers or PCSOs in them during the couple of days before they were closed, attempting to enforce them first?
I don't believe so, but there was not that element of enforcement. There was only elements of encouragement and engagement and explanation. So there were occasions in some parks where we've walked through them, we've gone through with vehicles and vans, and we've engaged with people to try and move them on and to try and explain what the legislation was. But if we recall back, this was some 10 days ago now, into the first weekend, when it was still uncertain as to what exactly the restrictions meant for people in terms of exercise and their leisure time.
So there will have been some parks that were closed in advance of any enforcement action taking place within them.
I can't answer that question without knowing the localities of each park, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Garry Forsyth.
Thank you, Chair. We've incorporated the urban parks as part of our patrol strategy, so officers have been attending those on regular occasions. What we've seen is, again, a high degree of adherence by people who are utilising the park for exercise. So we haven't seen any breaches there. We've been engaging with people throughout that and making sure people understand what the regulations are. So we haven't had any necessity at all working with our local authority partners to close any of the parks. We have put some, or local authorities have put some signage up in the parks, reinforcing the communication and the education piece that we're undertaking. And obviously the children's play area equipment in some of those is closed off as well.
Okay, Peter Goodman.
Yeah, I don't have much to ask. We haven't had massive problems in our urban parks at all in terms of behaviour, some very minor stuff that we've dealt with through engagement. So we've not had any conversations with our local councils about shutting parks. It's not been a big issue for us in urban areas.
Okay. Deanna Davidson.
Specifically for Garry, if that's all right. I understand that you've got one of the sort of really low rates of enforcement so far. Is there a concern that this might kind of show to the public that, you know, it's not necessarily being taken all that seriously and might not necessarily have the appropriate impact on people correcting their behaviour?
That's always a concern, but it's not one that we're seeing play out at the moment. Because we weren't in a position to enforce at the outset, we did focus very heavily on communicating the messages through our local communities, and we do have very good relationships with a lot of our local communities. One of the things that we did that we found worked very well for us is we actually put video messages out in 16 different languages through our social media channels and through our website and through other channels that we've got as well. And that's very much around focusing on the encouraging people, explaining what we're dealing with, and actually kind of bringing people together to help us, to help them, to ultimately help the NHS and save lives. So that message has worked very, very powerfully. And so we don't think there is a risk of people thinking that it's a soft touch and easy enforcement, because what we're trying to do is win the battle for hearts and minds, really. So in addition to putting out those messages, we've got a police partnership trust as well, which is a charity, and we've worked with our partners to identify vulnerable individuals, and we've delivered 107 care packages to vulnerable individuals through that police partnership trust that's working with the fire service, Police and Crime Commissioner's office, and so things like that, I think, enable us to really gain the support of the public and build on that momentum and encouragement that we've got around the engagement piece. That, you know, means we don't have to get to the enforcement phase, but clearly if we do, we will. And, you know, the messaging is very clear. Whilst we've only enforced one ticket, there have been a number of arrests and charges and prosecutions for people that have spat at NHS workers or indeed coughed towards officers as well. So our messaging is very clear around all of that, and it's important that we've got the support of the public to enable us to continue with it.
Thank you. And a question to all four of you. Have you noticed a significant, well, not an increase really, but have you noticed significant numbers of cases being reported? So people calling in and saying, I've just seen someone in the park, etc., etc. And if so, how have you been following those up and or enforcing them? If we go to you first, Garry.
So we haven't seen huge numbers coming into us. So we've seen a slight drop off in our overall call handling traffic. And obviously we've seen a reduction in the overall crime, which means that that's enabled us, when we look at our cancellation of non-essential training, and then redeploying those resources back onto the front line with the reduction in crime, that means that we can enhance our patrol activity in those areas. So it's about 1.6% of our overall information that's coming into our force control room at the moment relates to COVID matters. And we've seen one or two items passing on social media as well, which is another really good and effective way for us to respond to that. But we're not inundated with people reporting breaches of the guidance or adherence to the rules.
Thank you. And Peter?
Just over 11% of our calls to service from members of the public over the last weekend have been in relation to COVID-19. Some of it about things taking place in public spaces, some of it also about people entertaining at their home addresses as well. We do believe some of that is a little misguided. We do a little bit of it maybe malicious, getting your own back on your neighbours as well. But the vast majority of it has been about concerned members of the public doing a responsible thing. So we have seen a big shift in demand and we expect that to continue, especially with the bank holiday weekend coming up.
Thank you. And Lisa?
Thank you. Yes, likewise, we've seen a shift in demand in calls for service, but we've seen some calls into the control room and some social media, but predominantly good-willed members of the public just trying to prevent the spread of the virus, as opposed to people trying to create a bad feeling within that community, genuine concern now for the spread of the virus. We have strong engagement and neighbourhood policing model throughout the force, and those officers and staff have been engaging with those members of the public to provide that reassurance or guidance or advice about when those circumstances go beyond the encourage, explain stage, and we need to take further action. But again, enforcement is a last resort to educating the public about working together as a community to keep us all safe and save lives.
Thank you. And to John, please.
Yes, we've seen a significant increase in the calls around people not complying with the restrictions, but like my colleague in North Yorkshire, it's predominantly been people trying to assist and people talking about people breaching it in a way that's enabled us to get the neighbourhood policing team officers to the right place and to engage and encourage people in relation to it. So we've been able to cope with it, but it's been beneficial in some ways that it's been able to help us get to the right place.
Thank you. And one more question, if I may. I know that the NPCC guidance specifically referred to how we can encourage compliance amongst younger people. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that and any particular challenges that each of your forces are facing and how you're trying to overcome them. So if we go to you first, John.
Yeah, again, there's no specific challenges in relation to young people. Again, I'm cognizant of the reasons why young people may be out and about. But in reality, especially over this last week, it's been a significant improvement as people have been compliant. All of our staff who are doing the engagement work are predominantly neighbourhood policing team officers, know their communities, know the young people in which they work with. So it hasn't been an issue for us.
And Lisa?
Thank you. Yes, the first weekend of the guidelines, we did see a lot of reports of antisocial behaviour in young people in groups and people genuinely concerned for the spread of the virus. And since that time, we've obviously been out and the guidance has been more available and more talked about. And we've seen a huge reduction in those reports of antisocial behaviour in young people. We've put social media appeals out through parents to say, please, where are your children? We're just trying to protect them from harm. And we have very strong youth groups here, such as Youth Commission, who can communicate directly with young people as a peer group and try and encourage them to understand the risks. So that's had a very effective outcome here in North Yorkshire.
Thank you. And Garry?
Thank you. Yeah, so we've no particular challenges that we've identified just yet, although one of the things that we are doing, we're running an initiative called Keeping Beds Safe, which we're pushing through our website because this does give us an opportunity to do some things in a different way, and our community officers are actually running online competitions for children so they can participate in and deal with online. I don't think we'll quite be as big a runaway success as Joe Wicks, but early indications are we're getting some really positive feedback from our communities about how we can engage with some of our younger people in our communities around that.
Brilliant. And Peter?
Likewise, with colleagues, as we've got further into this public health crisis, we've found that the behaviour of all groups, all different backgrounds has improved, and the same with young people. We haven't had massive issues with young people ignoring the guidelines and the advice or breaching the regulations. Where we have had that, we've generally been able to resolve it through engaging with them. And we recognise that young people have different ways of engaging, so we're trying to be as innovative as we can be around use of different social media to engage them. And indeed, you'll probably see go viral at some point today, some of my officers trying to rap in one area of the city. Again, that's gone down really, really well in the local community, that the officers are trying to engage in a way that they understand.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all, and thank you. Please do pass on our thanks to your staff as well for everything they're doing at the moment.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you everybody for attending this panel. My question is very much about training. It's about the training that frontline officers have received, managers, as well as returning officers that may be coming back to the police force to help out, like retired officers. And it's really about how the training they've had in terms of the new legislation that's come about, but the type of training and how that's monitored in some way as well, because there's a lot of new information out there for the public, but also new information out there for the officers and how that's being managed. If we could go to Garry first.
I think we've used the word unprecedented quite a few times today, but to actually go from, starting out on a legislative process to implementation within such a short period of time is completely unheralded. So it has been a challenge, and I think that's why we've seen some of the challenges around the difference of interpretations early on. I think we're past that now. In terms of our training model locally, what we did was we did a cascade briefing through all of our frontline officers and teams through their supervisors, and we put caveats on there that nobody could go to any enforcement action until we had a documented audit trail of the fact that they'd received the appropriate training. So that's then been fed back through that and checked off as the training has been delivered through the supervisors. So we are confident that we know all of our officers and staff who've had the training and those that have yet to receive it because either they've been off on sick or self-isolate or anything, and they'll be wrapped up again in a cascade briefing with an audit trail when they return to duty. In terms of then officers who will be potentially coming back as volunteers or special constables as we start to deploy those later on, we'll look very much to employ the same approach to training them as well. And we're utilising some of our special constables at the moment and using them to very good effect. And those that are, we're training them before they're deployed. But actually we're holding some in reserve because it's been mentioned earlier around some of the issues of PPE, and we want to have a proportion of the workforce that we can bring in as a reserve should we need to. And it's important that we don't exhaust our PPE supplies with over provision of resource in some of these areas as well. But and we are collating a list of people, and thank you to all of those people that have expressed an interest to return to policing. It's been a considerable number. It's been really, really encouraging and really, really impressive. We're again not deploying those at the moment. We're holding those in a reserve position because actually we are operating at a level at the moment which is very much business as usual for us by managing the cancellation of non-essential training and those other elements. So but before anybody is deployed in any capacity, they'll have an assessment made of what the training is that they require to deliver the objectives that will be relevant to that role, and that'll be provided to them individually.
Thank you. Peter?
Well, thank you for the question. It's very similar again. We've tried to use as many different methods as possible in the organisation to reinforce what officers and police staff should be doing as well. Every one of my officers and staff have mobile devices. They've received cascade training through those. We've done it through sergeants' briefings. We've also done it through practice on the internet, including videos as well as PowerPoint presentations and the like. We actually haven't got any officers who have returned, who had retired before, but when they do come back, we will be looking to deploy them in roles where they can do that kind of thing as well. Really interestingly, during the course of April, our special constabulary have been a massive support to us. We've had 700 hours of additional service from our special constables, and they have all received the additional training as well. So our volunteer force are doing a fantastic job in supporting the front line at this time.
Brilliant, thank you. Lisa?
Thank you. I would echo everything that's already been said, and a huge thank you to that overwhelming response from the public of retired officers, volunteers who want to come and join us and assist. So a huge thank you. And again, we're not utilising those people just yet, but a training needs assessment would take place depending on when they left the service and how up to date their accredited training was at that point of rejoining us. Alongside those briefings and cascade training through electronic devices, we've also issued a pocket guide to all of our frontline officers and staff now to take out with them on patrol, just as a reminder and a reference guide to them alongside that training. Very good.
And finally, John.
What colleagues have said around the training methodology, other than every frontline officer has had that training, it is worth putting on record that the NPCC and College of Policing training product I think was excellent in the very short time frames that they had to put together. It gave clarity of the message and clarity of the tone of the policing style we want. We've done all of those things people have said. The additionality, we've also, as I said, it was one of the key challenges for us was communication in a large metropolitan force. We've been really clear through daily singular one gold briefing coming out to all staff across all of the organisation. And then there's also been a series of videos to set the policing style. And as any chief constable up and down the country will tell you, the way to test these things is actually to get out there yourself. So I've been on many briefings, as other colleagues will have done, to sit alongside the front line to see whether they understand the tone and temperament of exactly what we're trying to do here. And I'm pleased to say that in the main, they're there, they get why we're doing this. In terms of returners, we've got some very specifics around our communications facility, so they will slot straight back into what they already understand and do, so their retraining will be specific to them, and others will be specific to the role, because we don't envisage at this stage having returning frontline police officers out onto the streets, but we may get there in the future, depending upon how this crisis goes.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm just sort of conscious that we missed out the issue about beauty spots when I was asking about the urban parks earlier. But just obviously, Lisa and Peter, you're covering some of the areas around beauty spots, and you've also had questions raised both about drones issues, about the use of road checks and so on. What are your reflections a week on the concerns that were raised with you about some of those early measures, and also about whether or not they were effective, what the impact has had overall? Starting with Peter Goodman.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's been an interesting time for Derbyshire in the headlines during the course of the last couple of weeks, particularly around the drone usage. I should point out we haven't done any road checks in any of our beauty spots or the entry to any of our beauty spots. It's interesting, if you look at the footage from this weekend, Chair, you'll see lots of aerial footage in different parts of the country, and it's passed off without any kind of comment. So how the world changes in a week or so. We had a situation where we put the drones up because, frankly, the Peak Park was inundated by visitors in that weekend where we had the very nice weather, and we had local communities under siege. Particularly elderly members of our communities, elderly residents in our communities, felt that they couldn't leave their houses. They were already self-isolating, but they felt they couldn't go to the shop to get essentials. And when eventually they did go to the shops to get essentials, there was nothing in there because the tourists had taken absolutely everything. So it was a direct request from our communities in the Peak District that we did something to discourage people from coming. It was a bit controversial, but it created a conversation, and that's what we wanted to do with the public, to say, in these times, I don't care what the regulations say, but in these times of crisis, is it really the right thing to do to go and get in your car and drive to beauty spots where elderly and vulnerable communities are trying to survive anyway? The consequence of that is we've seen a huge drop-off in visiting to the national parks. But one thing we have noted, Chair, this weekend, that is across Derbyshire, through our ANPR networks, we have seen a slight increase in vehicle movements across the county, which suggests the battle's not completely won. And we need to keep reinforcing those messages that please stay away from beauty spots, because they will only remain rural and uninhabited if you don't go there. If people decide to go there, they become crowded spaces.
Ms. Winward.
Thank you. Yes, we have a unique, as I've already mentioned, geography of the thousands of square miles and thousands of miles of roads to police here. And we found that some of our local media messages weren't getting out to those millions of visitors that actually come from outside of our county. So we're bordered by 7 other counties, and lots of people do flood to our beauty spots, coastal areas, City of York. And we found that through setting up vehicle engagement points, that we were able to speak to people and discuss the guidance, absolutely adopt that engage, explain and encourage people not to travel those hundreds of miles to those beauty spots across our county and put people's lives at risk. And we've taken a lot of learning from that experience. We perhaps should have engaged with the media earlier because it did come out as a headline of a roadblock, which in legislation is a completely different tactic tactic and is a much more enforcement style of tactic, and that was not intended by us engaging with the public and just advising and providing that information to encourage them not to travel those hundreds of miles. The outcome, though, has been very positive on reflection. So I've been out on patrol in Whitby, for example, this week myself, very isolated, not many visitors at all other than local residents out doing their essentials. And we've seen a huge drop in that travel across our roads, and have found we've been able to remove those vehicle engagement points because the message appears to have got out there. So lots of pictures on social media in partnership this weekend of our empty beaches, empty national parks, and the fact that they will still be there after the crisis, and a thank you to the public for that engagement and that outcome of that early engagement through those vehicle points.
Holly Lynch.
To reiterate what's already been said by colleagues, can we just thank you once again? We are under no illusions about how difficult all of your jobs will be at the moment, so thank you to you and your colleagues on the front line. Just returning to PPE, which we have touched on, we are hearing anxieties from officers on the front line and from your colleagues at the Police Federation and the Superintendents Association before you in our first panel. I'm hearing from senior officers that there is PPE at police forces, but what are we doing inside those forces to make sure that that PPE is on the front line and available for officers as part of their day-to-day interactions with their communities? Chief Constable John Robbins, I am really grateful for our exchanges that we had earlier this week as my regional Chief Constable. So perhaps if we start with you, just for the benefit of the rest of the committee, what are we doing inside forces to make sure that that PPE is on the front line?
So there is a police-specific supply line into regional supply centres. In our region, it's in Wakefield, but there's 8 up and down the country. From those, they supply forces, and from those forces, depending upon the site, they then have an internal supply line out to the front line, which goes to districts, police stations, to teams. So there's regular checking throughout the day by officers on behalf of their colleagues about what equipment is in place. I want to make it really clear that there has been some really specific issues throughout all of this around gaining sufficient amounts of PPE. I'm confident in my force that officers who need PPE right now on the streets have got it. They've got access to it. Might not all be on them or with them at that moment in time. So there's 3 levels at this moment. For routine policing, where social distancing can apply, then like every other member of the public, there isn't a need for routine PPE. Secondly, where we're entering into a position where we're going to be within that 2 metres, maybe laying hands on through an arrest or a life-saving situation, of course they've got access to PPE with the vehicles. And then when we enter into the 3rd level, maybe the more significant high-risk areas around death and critical incidents involving people who are COVID positive, there's a 2nd level of higher protection of PPE. There is some guidance come out over the weekend around PPE for frontline officers that's come from Public Health England and through the NPCC and the NHS. And we're now working our way through that. But the challenge is always, as the NHS has seen, as the care system has seen, the challenge is getting the supply line right and getting the replenishment right and getting the equipment to people. But you know, my heart goes out to frontline officers and staff who's done a brilliant job over the last couple of weeks. Often, as the Federation of Superintendents Association has said, with sporadic elements of not having the right PPE. But they're stepping forward into this. They're doing their job of policing incredibly well. Our job as leaders is to make sure we can get our hands on as much PPE as we can. But we're in a period of national crisis. Internationally, the whole the supply chain is under pressure. So whilst we've got stocks, I'm not confident as to how long those stocks will last, especially as we go forward. But we're engaging with National Police Chiefs Council and the National Public, the MPOC organisation who resupplying us.
Okay. And Constable Winward in North Yorkshire.
Thank you. Yes, to echo what John said, I'm really grateful to the work of the staff associations in supporting their staff and officers, and their well-being is paramount to us as Chief Constables. If we can keep them safe, they can go out and keep the public safe. We're grateful for the national support that's been provided around this, to the work of NPOC and NPCC to get that supply chain moving in a more coordinated way now. So grateful for that. We have supplies. We've been out, as I'm sure my other colleagues have, to check physically that that PPE is available, and it is, and our officers and staff have it at the moment. I share John's concerns about the supply line continuing as this crisis continues.
Okay, and Chief Constable Garry Forsyth.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I could confidently, on behalf of all of my colleagues at Chief Constable level in the country and all senior leaders in policing, say that the safety and well-being of all of our staff is of absolute paramount importance to us at all times, and especially so at the moment. So it's incredibly important for us. I think Simon Kempton mentioned earlier on his evidence. You know, we're used to seeing officers running towards danger, but this is slightly different in that they can't see that danger, and there's a risk that they carry it home with them as well. So the use of PPE and the appropriate availability of PPE is obviously, really, really essential for all our officers and staff who are responding so brilliantly to the challenges that are being presented to them. We did have some difficulty in terms of, getting close to what our sustainable stocks were last week. I have to say the support we had through the Home Secretary dialing into the Chief Constable's call and giving us assurances around the PPE being made available did play out, and I know the Policing Minister intervened directly to support delivery through my PCC here to Bedfordshire. So we have had really good, encouraging support from that as well. I think the pace that this is moving at means the guidance is always changing. So that's going to be a challenge as we interpret the new guidance that comes from the various different places around making sure that we have got enough PPE available going forward. But we will do everything we can to ensure that our officers and staff have got the right levels of PPE. We currently have daily checks around it. We have over-ordered, but if the guidance changes, then we potentially have to use more of that, and we'll need to revisit the supply chains and over-order again. But we will do everything we can to make sure our officers and staff have got the PPE they need.
Okay, and in Derbyshire? Chief Constable Goodman?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the question. I won't reiterate what my colleagues have said. All that is true. I'll just add a couple of bits, if I may, though. Firstly, we've slightly changed our policing model. So some of the incidents that we would have gone to before, we are now dealing with an army of officers and staff who are working from home because they're self-isolating, and what they are able to resolve by other means than go into the incident, where we are doing that. We're doing it on the basis of threat, harm, risk and vulnerability. And the whole purpose of that is not because we can't cope. The whole purpose is to minimise the amount of risk that my officers face and means that we're able to provide a sustainable service over a longer period of time. And secondly, I'd say I think we've all been planning for quite a long time for this. We saw this coming over the hill, and we're in quite a fortunate position here in Derbyshire that we've got a lot of PPE equipment, masks, cervical gloves, goggles, everything that we need, and we have plentiful supplies that will see us through certainly the next 2 to 3 months. And that's because, again, a shout out to the public in Derbyshire, we've had local suppliers provide that for us. We've got nearly 2,000 sets of goggles provided by a local building firm, free of charge to us. We've had lots and lots of masks. In fact, we've got 21,000 masks at the moment provided by a local firm directly into us. So as well as having the national and regional coordination, the people of Derbyshire have stepped forward again.
Thank you very much.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask you about resources and the availability of officers for the front line. We've talked a bit about the huge impact on police numbers that obviously people in self-isolation and officers going off unwell with the virus will have. I was thinking in terms of your special constables, I know that there has been a campaign by a lot of police chiefs nationally to get employers to release their special constables on paid leave so they can report for duty, including amongst my local police force. I was wondering sort of what proportion of your special constables have had their employers agree to voluntarily release them for duty? And perhaps if I could start with Chief Constable Forsyth, just going across my screen from left to right.
So I would have to get back to you with those specific figures. As I mentioned, we are utilising our special constabularies in a limited basis at the moment because we want to hold them in strategic reserve. What we're seeing generally across the workforce at the moment is that our abstraction levels are running somewhere between 10 and 14%. And as I mentioned earlier on, with the cancellation of non-essential training and the reductions that we've seen in some of the overall demand that's created by a reduction in crime reporting, a reduction in call handling numbers, that means that we're able to utilise our resources to maintain business as usual at the moment across all of our areas of business. So for me, it's important that if we see a further spike in our abstraction rates and absence rates, for whatever the reason, then we're in a position to have a strategic reserve that comes in and backfills that through volunteers and through the use of the special constabulary. But I don't know the exact numbers of the availability of that special constabulary at the moment. I'll have to come back to you with those numbers.
No, that's fine. And I was just wondering, it's been brought to my attention because I asked a question about this in Parliament the other week. I've had a number of special constables from across the country contact me and say, well, look, I'd love to be able to, volunteer full-time with my force, but my employer isn't releasing me for duty. They're not willing to increase the amount of time I'm released for, and there is nothing in the law that can compel them to release me. So I suppose that's where my question's coming from, really. Have you had any resistance from people who want to volunteer but aren't able to because their employers won't let them? And would a tweak in the law or in government guidance be useful? Perhaps if I could go to Chief Constable Goodman.
Hi, thank you for the question. We have had some examples where employers have released people, but it's only been a few. I think it's 4 employers have released their special constables full-time supporters, and I'm really grateful to them. But I'm also really conscious as well that we've got an economy to keep running. So some employers, when we've approached them, have been reluctant because they want to keep their businesses running where possible. We have written to all of our special constables across the force to say, please have the conversation with your employer, and if they're interested, we'll carry on with that. But as I say, it's only a minor take-up rate at the moment. Having said that, our actual absence levels are dropping. They're down 5% from where they were at the start of the crisis, as we've got beyond the first 2 weeks of self-isolation. And all our trends are saying it's going to stay steady, if not decline a little further. So, like colleagues are saying, we are thinking about what we're doing in terms of special reserves as we move forward. But we are okay with things at the moment, and we think we will be for the time being.
Good news, thank you. Chief Constable Robbins.
Yeah, like many forces, the attendance levels have got better over the last week. We had a number of individuals off self-isolating and in the vulnerable categories. We're now down at 8.3 of our workforce. 8.3% is unable to work at this moment in time. But of that, there's a significant number who are actually working agilely as well, who are still putting in the work, but not in the workplace, if that makes sense. In terms of special constables, there's 282 across West Yorkshire. 18 of them are working full-time under the Employee Assistance Programme, and 177 of the others are also in the process of asking their employers, can they come and work for the police full-time? There's another group who we've got to remember are actually key workers, whether they be working in the NHS or in other situations as well, who unfortunately can't now use, but they're required elsewhere. So we're going through that process of getting as many special constables with the full warranted powers of police officers working alongside us. I'm grateful to those employers who've released them to date.
Thank you. Chief Constable Winward.
Thank you. Yes, likewise, we heard earlier the Federation say there was about a 13 or 14% abstraction rate. We've got about an 8% abstraction rate. That's both isolating and sick. So therefore, with the reduction in demand from things like nighttime economy and some of those other crimes, we're actually seeing an uplift in people that were turning out to deliver that engagement on our streets. So our capacity, fortunately, is good at the moment. I have the privilege of being the National Citizens in Policing Lead for NPCC. So that includes special constabulary, volunteers, etc. So I've been very privileged to be involved in some of that background work that you've talked about, and we are still doing that research. So in terms of employer-supported policing, there are 180 companies, some of them national companies, who are engaged in employer-supported policing, which offers their special constabulary members of staff 12 days a year to come out on patrol as a special constable. We've written to all of those companies asking them in this time of crisis whether they can expand on that amount. We have seen some companies where their staff can't work at the moment, and those staff are putting their uniforms on and coming out with us almost full time, which is great to see. We're gathering the data on what's called duty sheet, which keeps a record of all the special constabulary hours and duties. So we'll be able to collect that both nationally and locally and provide the committee with those figures shortly, because obviously extrapolating over a couple of weeks rather than individual days and shifts will give us a much better idea of what people were normally working before the crisis started and the subsequent weeks that followed that crisis and that request out for people to come and volunteer. And of course, as my colleagues have said, we're still at good capacity, so we might see more use of that capacity as things develop. We are looking at, in the background, the longer term opportunities to expand on the benefit of our special constabulary and volunteers in times of crisis, and how we might look longer term to change the legislation to support us in that.
Thank you. Just one follow-up question to you, Chief Constable Winward, if I may, since you're the national lead. You mentioned sort of a long-term project at looking at the legislation. Do you think a tweak in the law might be helpful? Because it occurs to me that since we passed the coronavirus bill a few weeks ago, health and social care workers have to be released, volunteers have to be released by employers, but there seems to be a bit of a grey area over releasing policing resources. And I imagine a pandemic may not be the only situation that we might feasibly face in the future where the power to have those individuals automatically released to you might be useful.
Absolutely, and I think we want to maintain that very special element of volunteering in policing, and therefore a look at the legislation in times of crisis would absolutely be welcomed, as opposed to a broader change in the legislation in terms of that volunteering, because it is a very special relationship at the moment in terms of our policing model.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Stephen Doughty.
And thanks again, Chief Constables, for all that you're doing and all your teams are doing. And also just want to sort of praise my own for South Wales Police, who even during the course of this committee, I've had officers coming back to me on a whole series of issues relating to some of the things we've been discussing today, and I'm really conscious about how hard everybody is working at this time. I wanted to ask, similar to the first panel, about the rise in domestic abuse that, or at least inquiries about domestic abuse that Refuge were highlighting today, and indeed the concerns I was raising as well about rising potential child safeguarding issues as well. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're experiencing in your forces, how you're responding to it, and whether you believe that there is a problem?
So
maybe start with Chief Constable. Yeah.
Oh, I've just been unmuted, so I think that's possibly me to go. So,
go for it.
So it is a concern for us, obviously, and we anticipated at the outset that we might see an increase in domestic abuse, and concerns are expressed around the child sexual abuse as well. We've included in our briefings to our officers, as part of our engagement approach, to actually be professionally curious as to why some people might not be indoors, because actually it might not be a safe place for them to be. And obviously to have that safeguarding awareness at the forefront of their mind when we're engaging with young people and potentially vulnerable individuals as well. One of the things that's been very useful for us to have as well, at PCC very early on made £60,000 available for the provision of accommodation, be it hotel or short-term rents for people who are subject of domestic abuse. So it's something we're very much alive to. I have to say, in terms of statistics and tracking of those offences at the moment, we're not seeing a particularly appreciable increase in domestic abuse or child sex abuse at this moment in time, but it's very early days. The long-term trend is an upwards one, but it's a little bit too early on in terms of the numbers to be able to make definitive judgments, but it's certainly something that we're alive to and we're tracking on a daily basis.
And are you making available, for example, through your 999 call centre, the provision where I think you can dial 55, for example, if somebody is experiencing domestic abuse but doesn't want to explain that on the phone?
Yes, we do. I'm pretty sure we have that available in ours. I remember reading that recently, so I think we have that.
Okay. Chief Constable Winward?
I think that my colleague Garry has said, we haven't seen an increase yet in those reports into our control room, but we have engaged with our officers and staff at briefing to just raise that awareness, to look out for those things when they're called to other incidents, and be more aware of those things that might not be reported because of the unique nature of people being perhaps trapped in a situation where they can't come and speak to us. So our staff are very alive to that. And I think the tester will be, through some of our partner agencies, we're doing a lot of work now where other agencies, voluntary agencies, domestic violence abuse coordination services, are seeing that increase in contact, even though it's not police contact at the moment. So that's a good indicator to us that there are some people starting to explore what their options are if they feel that they're in a difficult set of circumstances. So I think a real partnership approach to this will help us to uncover some of those statistics that I think we will see go up in terms of child abuse and domestic violence.
Chief Constable Goodman.
Thank you. Again, I won't repeat what my colleagues have said, but I think we all saw what the research in Italy and in China told us about domestic abuse and child exploitation. So we are doing all the things that my colleagues are doing, but at the same time, we're not seeing a statistical rise in incidents or indeed crimes. One of our concerns around that we're looking at very closely is that we are seeing a reduction in referral from partner agencies, partly because they have less capacity to do the work that they have to do. And we're busy working with them to try and make sure that we don't neglect that kind of referral from partner agencies, that it is as robust as possible.
Carry on.
And secondly, we've maintained all our resources. Our resourcing in those areas of policing are as strong as they've ever been, and we're not seeing burnout in those areas. Can I just put my national hat on for a moment, which is around cybercrime and serious and organised crime? Again, we are very concerned about CSEA online at the moment, particularly as more and more people are on their, online at home, not at work or at school. Again, we're working across government to try and make sure that we provide as many protective messages as possible and as many means as possible to discourage that. But also, we are maintaining some of our critical resources, our national and regional cybercrime capability, which we're turning to make sure we try and go after people who might be exploiting people online.
And just on that point about child sexual exploitation online, are you actually seeing an increase in incidents, or is it that you're expecting that there's potentially one and therefore preparing for it? What sort of evidence base are you looking at the moment?
Right, we at the moment, I think we're still relying upon the statistical data from Italy and from China. I think it's an emerging picture we've got here. So there is no, as far as I'm aware, no statistical basis for this. It's just good preemptive work.
Absolutely. And Chief Constable Robbins, do you think there's a lag going on between what, for example, Refuge was reporting today, 25% up in terms of calls to their helpline, 150% access to their website since the same period last year? Is there a lag between that then and what you're seeing sort of actually in reported cases?
All the professional judgment and experience as there is, and we will see this coming to the fore as this crisis goes forward. I mean, like colleagues have said, all of our safeguarding specialist resources are all still in place and all working really hard around this. We have seen no drop-off in the reporting of our domestic abuse situation in the last 2 weeks compared to the previous 2 weeks, or this last 2 weeks compared to last year. But professional judgment would say that we would expect to see more safeguarding issues within the household. It isn't just domestic abuse, it's, as Peter has said and others, it's around child sexual exploitation within the house, it's around child sexual exploitation online, and it's around indecent images of children and the vulnerabilities that puts live children into internationally. So we are working with colleagues nationally around domestic abuse and safeguarding campaigns, both nationally and locally. We're all revitalising our non-999 reporting processes, such as web chat or the methodology you use, because we've got to get access to it, because as well as that report there today, we're locally seeing more people accessing our domestic abuse online services, more people going to the self-help guidance, which has given us the indicator. As well as Peter has said, there's less reporting from those third-party safeguarding adults, whether it be teachers, carers, who've seen vulnerable children or people who've got access to. So it's a real cause for concern for us, and I mentioned it earlier as one of our significant challenges of the COVID crisis, not just the operational response to the physicality of help in the NHS, for the policing response, as well as keeping people vulnerable from exploitation, but also those organised crime groups who look to exploit people as well. So we're working very hard with the NCA, who provided some fantastic products recently to us.
Chief Constable Rose, I'm conscious of time, so maybe if you could just answer this question. We were talking in the previous panel about mental health and obviously, again, a likely increase in serious mental health issues and incidents the police have to deal with, including, tragically, people taking their own lives. What evidence have you seen so far? What evidence are you looking at from other countries? And what are you doing to support officers dealing with those incredibly difficult situations?
Yes, we have all the structures in place that every police force up and down the country will have in terms of officer and colleague support as the primary method, occupational health support and specialist support through trained officers called TRIM, which wraps around officers who've experienced these things. But it's often not just in the days and weeks ahead, it's in months and years ahead that you get the effects of these. But that policing family, that approach to looking after each other as we look after the public has always been really important to us and will continue to be important to us throughout this crisis. Statistically, we haven't seen any early signs yet about an increase in the tragedy of mental health or suicide. But again, that's maybe for the future to look back and see the pressures. I'm equally as worried about the effect upon the economy and the effect that it has on society and the effect that it has on business and future business-related crimes as well. There's a whole host of things that we've got to face and that we are facing. But the first step is to get control of this virus and support the NHS to save lives. And I think in the main, the public have been fantastic and what they've done to help us do that.
And just one practical question. We've heard some quite worrying stories in the last few days from funeral directors and indeed from some parts of the NHS that they don't necessarily have the equipment in terms of bags for appropriate removal of bodies, other equipment that would normally be used for both health and safety, but also dignity of all those involved. Are you confident that within police forces that you have the resources to deal with those more tragic situations appropriately?
Certainly within police we have. That's probably a matter for Ministry of Housing, communities and local government. And that's where the LRF, the Local Resilience Forum and the Strategic Coordination Groups are coming into their fore in relation to the planning for some of the most difficult parts of this crisis that are not directly police related, but also have an impact on policing. So for with us and within policing in terms of forensic recovery and our capabilities, yeah, we've got all the equipment we need. But there's another element here within local authorities and the LRF who I know from personal experience are on with planning that and have got good access to information and equipment.
Does anybody else want to add anything on either of those 2 points? No, thank you all.
Thank you. Tim Lawton.
Coming back to the issue of absence rates, I think you were sitting in on the earlier session and we heard that the estimate from the superintendent was that the absence rate was about 13%. We've heard certainly from the two Yorkshire forces here that the absence rate is nearer 8.5% in your experience, and you've seen people come back to work after self-isolation in the last few days. How do we explain that dichotomy? Are the figures wrong that we've had earlier? Are they out of date? Are they being skewed by the experience of the Met, which we know is the biggest hotspot for coronavirus cases and ahead of the rest of the country? Have we got any explanation for that? I mean, and what I was trying to get at before, and to get your take on it would be good, is the capacity issue that we've still got. If the obviously spread gets worse, as we expect in the next few days, and the expectations on the police are greater if the enforcement role becomes a tougher one. Can we start, Chief Winward, with you first?
Thank you. The national figures are obviously monitored on a daily basis, as are our local figures, and I can only suspect that the percentage that was quoted earlier by our staff associations is that average across the 43 forces. And of course, I think we up here in the Northern Yorkshire forces have not seen perhaps the sheer volume of contact and illness and impact on the community that perhaps some of our metropolitan built-up areas have seen. So actually we could provide that data in more detail to the committee if that would be helpful. The figures do include people who are off ill with flu-like symptoms, even though they might not have been tested for COVID, but also those people who are isolated for other reasons and therefore can't be at work because of people at home who might have the symptoms, and indeed then the abstraction rate of those that would be frontline but are working at home that are still delivering an element of service remotely from those places. So I think it might be helpful if we could provide a greater breakdown of those statistics.
Okay, is it, Chief Forsyth, is it a north-south thing? You're the southernmost force represented here. They just tougher up north, or what?
I couldn't possibly comment. But I think, I mean, Paul Griffiths mentioned earlier on, it's a 13.1% absence rate across the country nationally at the moment. I think we'll see some variations of that, and some of that will be linked to some of the spread that we're seeing of the virus across the country as well. I think similar to other forces, we would appear to have plateaued in terms of our sickness levels. So we got to about 14% at the highest point, and we're coming back down towards 10% now. But again, we may see that change as that goes on. The issue around capacity, as I mentioned a few times, we are currently operating as business as usual because some of the areas of business have reduced. That gives us extra capacity to operate in the areas that we want to flex into, around the engage and the assurance patrols that we want to be visible in those communities. We've got further options around withdrawing from some levels of service to create capacity in the organisation if the sickness levels increase further. And importantly, we're looking what we can do to have a strategic reserve of special constables and volunteers that we can bring back into flex that upwards as well. So we're nowhere near yet getting anywhere close to those areas where we start to take drastic action around withdrawal of service. We are comfortable operating as business as usual at the moment with the capacity that we've got, and we've got well tried and tested plans. I think John mentioned earlier on, a flu pandemic has been number one on the risk register for us for about 10 years or so now. So we do have tried and tested plans in place, and we will work through those to make sure we've got the right level of capacity that we need.
Chief Forsyth, just before I come to your two colleagues, what does reprioritisation look like if we get to that stage, notwithstanding there's a fair bit of flex in the system, as you say, at the moment?
So clearly we need to answer 3 9s calls. We need to respond to emergencies for the public that are the serious crimes that are taking place. We need to be able to retain custody facilities, and we need to be able to respond to armed response incidents and serious crimes. So those are sorts of things that you would see us reprioritising and giving a greater level of service as we start to deal with things in a slightly different way. That's not to say we won't deal with them, and everything would be risk assessed on the basis of threat, harm and risk, and we would do that on an individual basis. But those are the plans that we have for incremental close downs of some elements of our business. So for example, already what we've started to do, our business change function actually is not a critical reliant for us at the moment. So what we've taken people out of that to support things like our disclosure and barring service, who are experiencing an increase in workload to service the volunteers going to the NHS. So it's about flexing things across the organisation in that way.
Thank you. Chief Goodman, you didn't give your absent rate. I think you said it had come down 5%, but what are you in line with the others?
No, we are slightly higher. We're at 15%. And we think there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, we're not sure we're comparing apples with apples. There might be a bit of apples with pears in this. So, for example, we include in our figures those people who we've sent home because according to national guidance, they're in vulnerable groups and they should be self-isolating for a longer period of time. And we have a substantial number of those who have, who, particularly amongst our police staff, who have some quite difficult health conditions in the organisation. So they're included, so that probably makes a little bit of a difference. But also, we kind of looked at this and thought very early on, you know, if anybody thinks that they or anybody in their household maybe exhibited symptoms, we'd like them to go off straight away, because you know what, we'd rather have higher absence at the beginning and actually not spread it around the organisation than have higher absences as we move towards the end. And our experience has been that we've come down from nearly 20% to about 15%, just almost dead on 15% now, and that's been a fairly long-term trajectory. The other thing I'd say is the Midlands is a hot spot at the moment. It started in the West Midlands, it has spread across to the East Midlands in the community, So it does make you wonder if some of our staff are a bit more conscious of what symptoms feel like, because they feel like we're living in a bit of a hot spot. But, you know, we're doing fine. And I have to say, the reason we're doing fine is not because we're managing our absence well, it's because the public are behaving so brilliantly. So many of the calls to service that we would have got in normal circumstances, simply we aren't getting at the moment.
Yeah. Chief Robbins, and can I just add to your question, volunteers. So we heard earlier about volunteers of former police officers, retired or whatever, have been asked if they will come back. I just had a complaint from some of my retired police officers that they've signed up and they've heard nothing more. What's the experience in your force? Is it just mine who's hasn't got back to people because they're complaining now? Well, we could have volunteered for something else if we're not actually going to be needed.
I think most forces are experiencing a similar situation, but at this moment in time, there isn't a need to get volunteers back in, apart from for specialist services. However, they're just going through the technical processes of seeing how to get people back on board and get them back into the organisation. I think there's a note of caution with all of these attendance figures. To answer your previous question, there's a variance up and down the country, which the National Police Chiefs Council can get to you between 27% and 6%. Depending upon area, and it also depends and changes by day. So those figures that you heard earlier about the averages through that. So I think the challenge really is not so much the here and now is the second phase, the second wave of illness that is going to come as and when our staff, our frontline officers and staff get COVID and they have to isolate or self-isolate. And that's our big operational challenge that's coming down the line to us. So we're in a very fortunate, stable position with a conundrum of some crime going up, but others going down, some resources not being available to us, but other resources being able to be reprioritised into that engagement activity. But I think we're all in policing looking forward with some concern as to the next wave. Hence why we need to get volunteers, special constables, people retrained and equipped, plus the other facilities we've got within using some of our back office people into more of a frontline role. So that's the challenge now, is we've got hold of the current demand, we've got hold of the public response and the new restrictions, which we've already said it many times, we're grateful to the public for. We're just in contingency planning now as to that next wave that's going to hit us and how we prioritise our policing services then.
And finally, just Chief Robbins, perhaps you, when we do get back to some degree of normality, what is the biggest challenge going to be for policing?
I think one of the elements that's been unfortunate throughout all of this is the wider criminal justice system. Policing still at work, stepping forward into the face of the coronavirus. We still have to undertake our activity. Now, I don't know whether it's through design, deliberate government policy, or MOJ decisions, but unfortunately, the other criminal justice agencies don't seem to have been declared as key workers in this. So now we're seeing challenges with the Crown Prosecution Service in terms of being able to get charges upon people. You've all seen that the courts, bar very few single remand court cases, are no longer sitting in the magistrates' courts. You've seen the judiciary and the Crown courts no longer sitting. So I think the long-term effect of this cannot be taken into consideration until we see the backlogs going through. So it's not just a return to normality and immediacy of lifting restrictions, it's a return to normality to seeing how we progress the criminal justice processes going forward. Because each week and month that goes by, with those other agencies not working in the way in which they did before, I'm really concerned for victims and witnesses and attrition and a backlog and the care and welfare of those people who've been subject to crime. So I would like to see more done in relation to that wider criminal justice over the next few weeks, to try and see what we can get back on track, because forces like that have been very fortunate in some of the digital platforms we've got. Unfortunately, some of the other agencies aren't able to engage with that and apply the same principles. I don't criticise those agencies, I just reflect and say, well, it's just a shame that the wider criminal justice system is now slowed right down at a very time that we need to keep on top of it.
Interesting, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a quick few follow-on questions. You can just nod or shake your heads, and we'll note who nodded and shook their heads if for some of these. On the domestic abuse, are any of your forces or the agencies that you're actively working with proactively contacting households where you've had known abuse or call-outs previously? Nobody seems to be nodding. So I take it from that none of I'm
shaking my head because I don't know, frankly, Chair, so I'll have to get back to you on that.
That's fine. John Robbins? We've lost your sound. Sorry, John. Hang on a second. We've lost your sound.
Are you there? So the reason I didn't make any movement was that there's a mixed answer to this. There are safeguarding units working or recontacting victims, and there's victim referral agencies who are again recontacting victims. The issue I think you're alluding to is, are we proactively going back to previous victims? This is the challenge where we've got with the interagency working often so that interagency partnership would do that. So again, like Peter, I can't say we've got a specific initiative on for that, but I am confident that those ongoing live investigations and those who've been subject to repeat offending through MARAC processes, there will be identified officers and police staff and other agencies who will get in contact with them.
Thanks. We're seeking additional information on domestic abuse, so any further information you can give us on any proactive work would be immensely helpful. Secondly, just going back to PPE, do any of you have facts on the proportion of your response cars that are in operation without PPE at any one time? Peter Goodman?
None. All of our response cars are fully equipped with PPE.
Gary?
Likewise, none. All of ours are equipped as well.
John?
Yeah, none, all are equipped. I think the references earlier may have been to the first part, the first few days of challenge, but right now, none at all.
Lisa?
Likewise, all equipped at the moment, thank you.
Holly, did you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, thank you. And I wondered if Tim might have asked this earlier, but in relation to spit guards, are your forces using them, and have your officers got them on the front line to help protect them from the COVID-19 threat at this time?
So from my perspective, spit guards are a personal issue to all of our officers and staff, and they are free to use them as part of their personal protective equipment when dealing with members of the public.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add on that? John?
Yes, we're fortunate that spit guards have been issued as part of PPE for some time in West Yorkshire, alongside body-worn video, which again assists in evidence gathering and protecting police officers as we go forward in this crisis, like this, same as routine policing.
Okay, Peter.
And just likewise, you know, I think we're all increasing the number of tasers that our officers have as well, which are actually a really good distancing tool when we're coming across situations which are difficult and where it's appropriate to do so. So all Share have all of those things available to them.
Have you been told that you are definitely going to have access to testing as part of the government's testing strategy once the NHS testing is achieved? Gary?
So my latest understanding from a regional conference call earlier on today was that Eurofins are making some antigen tests available to policing, and they should be available in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And we are also hoping to get some spaces in the COVID-19 slots in the NHS pipeline as well in the next 2 to 3 weeks. But rightly, they're obviously being prioritised to NHS staff at this moment in time. But that would be enormously helpful for us in terms of managing people back into the workplace.
And so who did you say you were getting them from? And did you say those were the antigen tests and not the antibody tests?
Well, my understanding is it's the antigen tests and it's Eurofins, one of our forensic suppliers.
Peter Goodman.
Can I act as a proxy, Chair, to Martin Hewitt, the Chair of MPCC, who sent me this text message when it was asked earlier? At the moment, there are no tests validated by Public Health England. We will not be on the list for antigen tests that the NHS are getting at this moment, but the Home Office are pushing for it. We're progressing the antigen test by the Forensic Network and may have that by late April. All still needs to be pushed through, though.
Thank you. And then finally, we're obviously aware that the government has at all times has to consider whether it needs stronger regulations in place in order to support the NHS and to support the health measures in place. There are different things they could be considering or could be trading off around further restrictions on non-essential workplaces where people are currently still going to work, or further restrictions on people being able to go outside for exercise. Given the different consequences of different measures and the possible trade-offs between them, and that some will have more impact on you than others, some might have more impact on things like domestic abuse than others, have you been involved in the discussions about the trade-offs around any further restrictions that might be introduced? Obviously none of you individually, but are you aware whether the police have been involved in any of those discussions?
So, Chair, I think Martin Hewitt, the National Police Chiefs Council, and various NPCC leads may have been involved, but we'll have to check and come back to you. But I think the answer is always going to be around following the science and following the Public Health England guidelines as to whether that will make it safer for our communities. But I'm not aware, on behalf of colleagues, that we've been directly involved in further proposals.
Thank you. Garry Forsyth.
So, Chair, just a brief one. I know, and I've mentioned it a few times now, it's the pace of this change. So when the original guidance was put in place, we did have a very short window through Charlie Hall's Operational Policing Committee to give feedback to the government in relation to our views around that. And I think it's fair to say as well that we have been listened to in terms of the input that we've made back through central government. So I'm assuming, again, through Martin and through the team centrally, we'll be afforded that opportunity.
Thank you very much. Can I thank you all of you again for your evidence this afternoon? We very much appreciate it. We're also very conscious that you have a job to do, which is to implement health measures that are about saving lives. And the work that you are doing and that all of your officers are doing can sometimes be difficult, but in the end is about saving lives, is about protecting the NHS, and that you're doing it in the interests of everybody. So we thank you very much for that work that you are doing and look forward to seeing the further evidence that we've asked you for. Thank you again. Order. That is the end of our evidence session this afternoon.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.